don't you?
No, you're probably right. They probably do. Uncharitable bastards. They're the snobs.
Alice tossed an acorn overhand at the fountain. It tipped off one of the dying priest's sturdy knees and into the water.
I don't know. Not necessarily. No, I don't think we are. We have nothing against them.
Exactly. Some of them are perfectly fine.
Some of them we hold in the highest esteem.
Exactly. So what are you saying? We should go out and make friends?
She shrugged.
They're the only other magicians our age on the continent. They're the only peers we'll ever have.
The sky was burning blue and the tree branches stood out sharply against it in the clear shivering reflection in the fountain.
Okay, but not with all of them.
Well, God, no. We'll be discriminating. Anyway, who even knows if they'll want to be friends with us?
Right. So who? Who?
Does it matter?
Of course it matters, Vix. It's not like they're all the same.
Vix was a term of endearment with them, short for vixen, an allusion to their Antarctic interlude, vixen being the word for a female fox.
So, who?
Surendra.
Okay, sure. Or no, he's going out with that horrible second year. You know, with the teeth. She's always trying to make people do madrigals after dinner. What about Georgia?
Maybe we're overthinking this. We can't force it. We'll just let it happen naturally.
Okay. I watched her study her nails with her intense, bird-like focus. Sometimes she looked so beautiful I couldn't believe she had anything to do with me. I could barely believe she existed at all.
But you have to do it. If it's me, nothing's going to happen. You know I'm pathetic at that kind of thing. You weren't supposed to agree.
And so, with a concerted effort, they roused themselves from their stupor and embarked on a belated campaign to socialize with the rest of their class, most of whom they drifted almost completely out of touch with. In the end, it wasn't Surendra or Georgia, but Gretchen, the blonde girl who walked with a cane, who turned out to be the key. It helped that Alice and Gretchen were both prefects, which was a source of both pride and embarrassment to them. The position carried with it almost no official duties. Mostly it was just yet another absurd and infantilizing idea borrowed from the English public school system, a symptom of the Anglophilia that was embedded so deeply in the institutional DNA of Brakebills. Prefectships were given to the 4 students in the 4th and 5th years with the highest GPA, who then got, or had, to wear a silver pin in the shape of a bee on their jackets. Their actual responsibilities were petty things like regulating access to the single phone on campus, an obsolete rotary monster hidden away in a battle-scarred wooden phone booth that was itself tucked away under a back staircase, which always had a line a dozen students long. In return, they had access to the prefect's common room, a special locked lounge on the east side of the house with a high, handsome arched window, and a cabinet that was always stocked with sticky sweet sherry that Quentin and Alice forced themselves to drink. The prefect's common room was also an excellent place to have sex in, as long as they could square it with the other prefects in advance, but that usually wasn't a problem. Gretchen was sympathetic, since she had a boyfriend of her own, and the third prefect was a popular girl with spiky blonde hair named Beatrice, whom nobody had even realized was especially smart before she was named a prefect. She never used the room anyway. The only real trick was avoiding the 4th prefect, because the 4th prefect was, of all people, Penny. The announcement that Penny was a prefect was so universally, gobsmackingly surprising that nobody talked about anything else for the rest of the day. Quentin had barely spoken to Penny since their infamous altercation, not that he'd gone looking for him. From that day on, Penny had become a loner, a ghost, which was not an easy thing to be at a school as small as Brakebills. But he had a talent for it. He walked quickly between classes with a flat, frozen stare on his round frying pan face, bolted his food at mealtimes, went on long, solitary rambles, stayed in his room in the afternoons after class, went to bed early, got up at dawn. What else he did, nobody knew. When the Brakebill students were sorted into groups by discipline at the end of second year, Penny wasn't assigned to a group at all. The rumor was that he had tested into a discipline so arcane and outlandish, it couldn't be classified according to any of the conventional schemes. Whether it was true or not, next to his name on the official list, Fogg had simply put the word independent. He rarely turned up in class after that, and when he did, he lurked silently in the back of the room with his hands shoved in the pockets of his fraying Brakebills blazer, never asking questions, never taking notes. He had an air of knowing things other people didn't. He was sometimes seen in the company of Professor Vander Wege, under whose guidance he was rumored to be pursuing an intensive independent study. The prefect's common room was an increasingly important refuge for Quentin and Alice because their old sanctuary, the cottage, was no longer sacrosanct. Quentin had never really thought about it, but it was pure chance that last year nobody new had been placed in the physical group, thus preserving the integrity of their little clique. But the drought was bound to come to an end, and it did. At the end of the previous semester, no fewer than 4 rising third years had tested into physical, and now, although it seemed wrong in every possible way, they had as much right to the cottage as Quentin and Alice did. They did their best to be good sports about it. On the first day of classes, they sat patiently in the library as the new physical kids went through the ritual and broke into the cottage. They debated long and earnestly about what to serve the newcomers when they came in, finally settling on a goodish champagne and not wanting to be selfish, even though that was exactly how they felt, an obscenely expensive array of oysters and caviar with toast points and creme fraiche, the new physical kids said, one after the other, as they made their way inside. They goggled at the oversized interior. They inspected the bric-a-brac and the piano and the cabinet of alphabetized twigs. They looked impossibly young. Quentin and Alice made small talk with them, trying to be witty and knowing, the way they remembered the others having been when they first got there. Sitting in a row on the couch, the third years squirmed and sipped their champagne too quickly, like children waiting to be excused. They asked polite questions about the paintings and the cottage library. Do the books circulate outside the building? Did they really have a first edition Abecedarian Arcana in the hand of Pseudo-Dionysius himself? Really? And when was the cottage first constructed? Really? Wow! That's old. That's, like, ancient. Then, after a suitable interval, they disappeared en masse into the pool room. They showed no particular desire to be chaperoned there, and Quentin and Alice had no particular desire ever to see them again, so they stayed where they were. As the evening wore on, the sounds of adolescent bonding could be heard. It became apparent to Quentin and Alice that they were relics of an earlier era that had worn out its welcome. They'd come full circle. They were outsiders again.
I feel like an elderly docent.
I already forget their names. They're like quadruplets.
We should give them numbers. Tell them it's a tradition.
And then we could always call them by the wrong number. Freak them out. Or we could call them all the same thing. Alfred or something.
Even the girls?
Especially the girls.
They were sipping tepid, leftover champagne. They were getting drunk, but Quentin didn't care. From the pool room came the glittery tinkle of breaking glass, a champagne flute. Probably, and then, a little later, the sound of a sash being raised and somebody throwing up hopefully out the window.
The problem with growing up is that once you're grown up, people who aren't grown up aren't fun anymore.
We should have burned this place down. Been the last ones out the door and then torched it.
Then walked away with it burning behind us in the background, like in a movie.
End of an era, end of an epoch. Which one? Era or epoch? What's the difference?
Thoughtful, I didn't know. We would have to find something else, I thought, mazily. Something new. Couldn't stay here anymore. Couldn't go back. Only forward. Do you think we were ever like this, like these kids?
Probably. I bet we were even worse. I don't know how the others put up with us.
You're right. You're right. God, they were so much nicer than we are. Thoughtful that winter I didn't go home for the holidays. Around Christmas time, real-world Christmas, I'd had the usual conversation with my parents about Brakebills' unusual schedule, which I had to remind them about every year, lounging inside the old phone booth under the back stairs, with one foot braced up against the folding wooden door. Then, by the time Brakebills' Kalangana Christmas rolled around, it was already March in the real world, and it didn't seem like such a big deal not to go back. If they had asked me if they'd put it out there for an instant that they were eager to see me, or that they would be disappointed if I didn't come, I might have caved. I would have, in a second. But they were their usual blithe, oblivious, glassine selves. And besides, I got an independent feeling from coolly informing them that I had other plans. Thanks very much. And thoughtful, instead, I went home with Alice. It was her idea, though as it got closer to the holidays, I wasn't exactly sure why she'd invited me. since the prospect obviously made her suicidally uncomfortable.
I don't know. It just seemed like the kind of things boyfriends and girlfriends do.
Well, whatever. I don't have to come. I'll just stay here. Just say I had a paper to finish or something. I'll see you in January.
But don't you want to come?
Of course I do. I want to see where you come from. I want your parents to know who I am. And God knows I'm not taking you back to my parents' house.
All right. Do you promise to hate my parents as much as I do?
Maybe even more.
The opening of the portal's home for vacation was always a complicated and tedious procedure that inevitably led to huge numbers of Brakebillions backed up with all their luggage in a ragged line that wound down the dark, narrow corridor leading to the main living room, where Professor van der Wegge was in charge of getting people where they needed to go. Everybody was relieved that exams were over, and there was always a lot of giddy pushing and shoving and shrieking and casting of minor pyrotechnic spells. Quentin and Alice waited together in silence with their packed bags, solemnly, side by side, Quentin looking as respectable as he could manage. He hardly had any clothes anymore that weren't part of his Brakebills uniform.
Thoughtful I knew Alice was from Illinois. And I knew Illinois was in the Midwest, but I couldn't have pointed to the precise location of that state within 1,000 miles. Apart from a European vacation in junior high, I'd barely ever been off the East Coast, and my Brakebills education hadn't done much to improve my grasp of American geography. And as it turned out, I hardly saw Illinois anyway, or at least not its exterior.
Professor van der Wegge set up the portal to open directly into an anteroom inside Alice's parents' house. Stone walls, flat mosaic floors, post and lintel doorways on all sides. It was a precise recreation of a traditional bourgeois Roman residence. Sound echoed in it like a church. It was like stepping past the red velvet rope at a museum. Magic tended to run in families. Quentin was an exception in that respect, and Alice's parents were both magicians. She had never had to sneak around behind their backs the way he had to with his parents.
Welcome to the house. That time forgot to forget.
She led him by the hand along an alarmingly long, dark corridor to a sunken living room with cushions and hard Roman-style couches strewn around at careless angles and a modest plashing fountain in the middle.
Daddy changes it all around every few years. He mostly does architectural magic. When I was little, it was all Baroque. Gold knobs on everything. That was almost nice. But then it was Japanese paper screens. You could hear everything. Then it was Falling Water Frank Lloyd Wright until Mam got sick of living in a mildew farm for some reason. And then for a while it was just a big old Iroquois longhouse with a dirt floor. No walls. That was hilarious. We had to beg him to put in a real bathroom. I think he seriously thought we were going to watch him defecate into a pit. I doubt even the Indians did that.
With that, she sat down heavily on a hard leather Roman couch, opened a book, and became absorbed in her vacation reading.
Thoughtful I understood that it was sometimes better to wait out Alice's black periods than to try to coax her out of them. Everybody has their own idiopathic reaction to their childhood home. So I spent the next hour wandering around what looked remarkably like an upper-middle-class Pompeian household. Complete with pornographic frescoes, it was obsessively authentic except for the bathrooms. A concession had obviously been granted on that score.
Even dinner, when it arrived, served by a squad of 3-foot-tall animated wooden marionettes who made little click-clacking noises as they walked, was revoltingly historical. Calf brains, parrot tongues, a roasted moray eel, all peppered beyond the point of edibility, just in case they weren't inedible to begin with. Fortunately, there was plenty of wine. They had progressed to the third course, the stuffed and roasted uterus of a sow, when a short, portly, round-faced man suddenly appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a well-worn toga the gray of unlaundered bedsheets. He hadn't shaved for several days, and his dark stubble extended well down his neck, and what hair he had left on his head could have used cutting.
Evocate Bells! Welcome to the Domus of Danielus.
He made a face that implied that it was other people's fault that the joke wasn't funny.
Hi, Dad. Dad, this is my friend Quentin.
Hi.
He'd been trying to eat reclining Roman style, but it was harder than it looked, and he had a stitch in his side. Alice's father shook his outstretched hand. He seemed to forget he was doing it halfway through, then looked surprised to find a fleshy alien extremity still in his grip.
Are you really eating that stuff? I had Domino's an hour ago.
We didn't know there was anything else. Where's Mom?
Who knows? She was working on one of her compositions downstairs last I saw. Last I saw.
He jogged the few steps down into the room, sandals slapping the stone tiles, and served himself some wine from a decanter.
And that was when? November?
Don't ask me. I lose track of time in this damn place.
Why don't you put in some windows, Daddy? It's so dark in here.
Windows! You speak of some barbarian magic of which we noble Romans know nothing.
You've done an amazing job here. It looks really authentic.
Thank you!
Alice's father drained the goblet and poured himself another, then sat down heavily on a couch, spilling a purple track of wine down the front of his toga in the process. His bare calves were plump and bone-white. Black bristles stood straight out from them in static astonishment.
I wondered how my beautiful Alice could possibly share a single base pair of genetic information with this person.
It took me 3 years to put it together. 3 years. And you know what? I can't eat the food. There are skid marks on my toga, and I have plantar fasciitis from walking around on these stone floors. What is the point of my life? Would someone tell me that, please? Because I have no idea. None!
Alice glared at her father like he'd just killed her pet. Quentin stayed perfectly still as if that meant that Alice's father, like a dinosaur, couldn't see him. They all three sat in awkward silence for a long beat. Then he stood up.
Great yes and good night.
He tossed the train of his toga over his shoulder and strode out of the room. The marionette's feet clacked on the stone floor as they mopped up the spilled wine he left behind.
That's my dad.
She rolled her eyes as if she expected a laugh track to kick in behind her. None did.
Thoughtful. In the midst of this domestic wasteland, Alice and I established a workable, even comfortable routine for themselves, invaders staking out a safe perimeter deep in hostile territory. It was weirdly liberating to be in the middle of somebody else's domestic agony. I could see the bad emotional energy radiating out in all directions, sterilizing every available surface with its poisonous particles, but it passed through me harmlessly, like neutrinos. I was like Superman here. I was from off-planet, and that made me immune to any local villainy. But I could see it doing its ruinous work on Alice, and I tried to shield her as best I could. I knew the rules here instinctively, what it meant to have parents who ignored you. Thoughtful, the only difference was that my parents did it because they loved each other. Alice's because they hated each other.
If nothing else, the house was quiet and well stocked with Roman-style wine, sweet but perfectly drinkable. It was also reasonably private. He and Alice could share a bedroom without her parents caring or even noticing. And there were the baths. Alice's dad had excavated huge cavernous underground Roman baths that they had all to themselves, huge oblong aquifers scooped out of the Midwestern tundra. Every morning they would spend a good hour trying to fling each other into the scalding caldarium and the glacial frigidarium, which were equally unbearable, and then soaking naked in the tepidarium.
Over the course of 2 weeks, I glimpsed Alice's mother exactly once. If anything, she looked even less like Alice than Alice's father did. She was thin and tall, taller than her husband, with a long, narrow, animated face and a dry bunch of blonde-brown hair tied back behind her head. She chattered earnestly to me about the research she was doing on fairy music, which was, she explained, mostly scored for tiny bells and inaudible to human beings. She lectured me for almost an hour with no prompting on my part, and without once asking me who I was or what exactly I was doing in her house. At one point, one of her slight breasts wandered out of the misbuttoned cardigan that she wore with nothing under it. She tucked it back in without the slightest trace of embarrassment. I had the impression that it had been some time since she had spoken to anybody. Worried. So I'm a little worried about your parents. I think they might be completely insane.
They had retreated to Alice's bedroom, where they lay side by side on her enormous bed in their bathrobes, looking up at the mosaic on the ceiling. Orpheus singing to a ram, an antelope, and an assortment of attentive birds.
Are they?
Alice, I think you know they're kind of weird.
I guess I mean I hate them, but they're my parents. I don't see them as insane, I see them as sane people who deliberately act like this to torture me. When you say they're mentally ill, You're just letting them off the hook. You're helping them elude prosecution. Anyway, I thought you might find them interesting. I know how mentally excited you get about anything magical. Well, voila, for your enjoyment, 2 career magicians.
At any rate, I can see where you get your social skills.
My point is, you don't know what it's like to grow up in a family of magicians.
Well, I didn't know you had to wear a toga.
You don't have to wear togas. That's exactly the problem, Q. You don't have to do anything. This is what you don't understand. You don't know any older magicians except our professors. It's a wasteland out there. Out here, you can do nothing or anything or everything and none of it matters. You have to find something to really care about to keep from running totally off the rails. A lot of magicians never find it.
Worried. Her voice was strangely urgent, almost angry. I was trying to catch up to her. So you were saying your parents didn't?
No, they didn't. Despite their having had 2 children, which would have given them a minimum of 2 good options. Well, I think they might have cared about Charlie, but when they lost him, they lost their way completely. And here they are.
What about your mom and her fairy orchestras? She seems pretty serious about them.
That's just to annoy my dad. I'm not even sure they exist.
Suddenly, Alice rolled over on top of him, straddling him, hands on his shoulders, pinning him down. Her hair hung straight down at him in a shimmering curtain, tickling his face and giving her the very authoritative appearance of a goddess leaning down from the heavens.
You have to promise me we'll never be like them, Quentin.
Their noses were almost touching. Her weight on top of him was arousing, but her face was angry and serious.
I know you think it's going to be all quests and dragons and fighting evil and whatever, like in Fillory. I know that's what you think, but it's not. You don't see it yet. There's nothing out there. So you have to promise me, Quentin. Let's never get like this, with these stupid hobbies nobody cares about. Just doing pointless things all day and hating each other and waiting to die.
Well, you drive a hard bargain. But, okay, I promise.
I'm serious, Quentin. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be so much harder than you think. They don't even know Quentin. They think they're happy. That's the worst part.
She undid the drawstring on his pajama bottoms without looking and jerked them down, still staring directly into his eyes. Her robe was already open at the waist and she had nothing on under it. He knew she was saying something important, but he wasn't grasping it. He put his hands under her robe, feeling her smooth back, the curve of her waist. Her heavy breasts brushed against his chest. They would always have magic. They would have it forever. So what?
Potful. Maybe they are happy. Maybe this is just who they are.
No, Quentin. They aren't, and it isn't.
She twined her fingers into his hair and gripped it hard so that it hurt. They were moving together now, breathing hard. Quentin was inside her and they couldn't talk anymore except for Alice just repeating.
Promise me, Q. Promise me. Just promise.
She said it angrily, insistently, over and over again, as if he were arguing, as if he wouldn't have agreed to absolutely anything at that moment. Graduation. In a way, it was a disaster of a vacation. They hardly even went outside except for a few walks, undertaken at a brisk trot. Through the freeze-dried Urbana suburbs, so flat and empty it felt like at any moment they could fall off into the immense white sky. But in other ways it was perfect. It brought Alice and Quentin closer together. It helped Quentin understand why she was the way she was. They didn't fight once. If anything, the terrifying counterexample of Alice's parents made them feel young and romantic by contrast. And after the first week, they'd finished all their homework and were free to lie around and goof off. By the time 2 weeks were up, they were thoroughly stir-crazy and ready to start their last semester at Brakebills.
We'd heard almost nothing from the others since last summer. I hadn't really expected to. Of course, I was curious about what was going on in the outside world, but I had the idea that Elliot and Josh and Janet were busy ascending to some inconceivable new level of coolness, as far above Brakebills as Brakebills was above Brooklyn or Chesterton, and I would have felt let down if they'd still had the time and inclination to bother keeping in touch with me. As far as I could deduce from their scattered reports, they were all living together in an apartment in downtown Manhattan. The only decent correspondent among them was Janet, who every couple of weeks sent the cheesiest New York postcard she could find. She wrote in all caps and kept the punctuation to a minimum.
Dear Q&A, what it is we three went to Chintown last week too. Look for hers. Elliot bought a Mongolian spellbook. It's in Mongolian, but he claims he can read it, but I think it's Mongolian porno. Josh bought a little green baby turtle. He named it Gamera after the monster. He is growing a bear, Josh, not Gamera. Guys have got to get here. Brakebills is a small pond, and NYC is the ocean, and Eileen is drinking like a fish. Stop it, Elliot, stop it. I kill you for this, I kill you 1,000 times. So much love, Jay. Despite widespread popular resistance, or possibly because of it, Dean Fod entered Brakebills in an international welters tournament, and Quentin traveled to overseas magic schools for the first time, though he didn't see much of them beyond the welters court, and once in a while a dining hall. They played in the emerald green courtyard of a medieval keep in the misty Carpathians, and at a compound bushwhacked out of the seemingly endless Argentine pampas. On Rishiri Island off the northern coast of Hokkaido, they played on the most beautiful welters court Quentin had ever seen. The sand squares were a searing white and perfectly scraped and leveled. The grass squares were lime green and clipped to a regulation 12 m. The water squares steamed darkly in the chilly air. Frowning, uncannily humanoid monkeys watched them play, clinging to wiggly pine trees, their bare pink faces ringed with nimby of snowy white fur.
But my world tour was cut short when, to Professor Fogg's acute embarrassment, the Brakebills team lost all 6 of its first 6 matchups and exited the tournament. Their perfect losing record was preserved forever when they were crushed at home in the first round of the consolation bracket by a pan-European team captained by a tiny, fiery, curly-haired Luxembourgeoise on whom I, along with every other boy on the Brakebills team and some of the girls, developed an instant crush. Worried the welters season ended on the last day of March, and suddenly I found myself staring at the end of my Brakebills career across a perilously slender gap of only 2 months of time. It was like I'd been wending my way through a vast glittering city, zigzagging through side streets and wandering through buildings and haunted Deshiriko arcades and little hidden piazzas, the whole time thinking that I'd barely scratched the surface, that I was seeing just a tiny sliver of one little neighborhood. And then suddenly I turned a corner, and it turned out I'd been through the whole city. It was all behind me, and all that was left was one short street leading straight out of town. Now, the most insignificant things I did felt momentous, brimming over with anticipatory nostalgia. I'd be passing by a window at the back of the house, hurrying between classes, and a tiny movement would catch my eye. A distant figure trudging across the sea in a Brakebills jacket, or a gawky topiary flamingo fussily shedding the cap of snow on its little green head, and I would realize that I would never see that particular movement ever again, or if I did, I would see it in some future time as some unimaginably different person. And then there were the other moments when I was violently sick of Brakebills and everything and everyone in it, when it felt lame and pokey and claustrophobic and I was desperate to get out. In 4 years, I'd barely even set foot off the Brakebills campus. My God, I was wearing a school uniform. I'd essentially just spent 4 extra years in high school. Students had a particular way of speaking at Brakebills, an affected, overly precise, quasi-British diction that came from all those vocal exercises, like they were just freshly back from a Rhodes Scholarship and wanted everybody to know it. It made me want to lay about him with an edged weapon. And there was this obsession with naming things. All the rooms at Brakebills had the same identical desk, a broad-shouldered, black cherrywood hulk that must have been ordered up in bulk sometime in the second half of the 19th century. It was honeycombed with little drawers and cubbies and pigeonholes, and each of those drawers and cubbies and pigeonholes had its own precious little name. Every time I heard somebody drop a reference to the ink chink and the old dean's ear, I rolled my eyes at Alice. Sweet Jesus, are they serious? We have got to get out of this place. Worried. But where was I going to go exactly? It was not considered the thing to look panicked or even especially concerned about graduation. But everything about the world after Brakebills felt dangerously vague and underthought to me. The bored, bedraggled specters of Alice's parents haunted me. What was I going to do? What exactly? Every ambition I'd ever had in my life had been realized the day I was admitted to Brakebills, and I was struggling to formulate a new one with any kind of practical specificity. This wasn't Fillory, where there was some magical war to be fought. There was no Watcher woman to be rooted out. no great evil to be vanquished, and without that everything else seems so mundane and penny ante. No one would come right out and say it, but the worldwide magical ecology was suffering from a serious imbalance. Too many magicians, not enough monsters. Worried, it made it worse that I was the only one who seemed to be bothered by it. Lots of students were already actively networking with established magical organizations. Shurendra lectured anybody who would listen about a consortium of wizards whom he hadn't actually heard from yet, but he was pretty sure they'd basically guaranteed him an internship, who spent their time at suborbital altitudes keeping a weather eye out for stray asteroids and oversized solar flares and other potential planetary-scale disasters. Plenty of students went in for academic research. Alice was looking at a postgraduate program in Glasgow, though the idea of being separated didn't particularly appeal to either of us. Nor did the idea of my aimlessly tagging along with her to Scotland. Thoughtful, it was considered chic to go undercover to infiltrate governments and think tanks and NGOs, even the military, in order to get oneself into a position to influence real-world affairs magically from behind the scenes. People devoted years of their lives to it, and there were even more exotic paths. A few magicians illusionists in particular undertook massive art projects, manipulating the northern lights and things like that. Decades-long enchantments that might only ever have an audience of one. There was an extensive network of wargamers who staged annual global conflicts over arbitrary tactical objectives just for the fun of it. Sorcerers against sorcerers in teams and free-for-all battles royal. They played without safeguards, and it was well known that once in a blue moon someone got killed. But that was half the fun of it, the thrill. Worried and on, and it all sounded completely horribly plausible. Any one of 1,000 options promised basically guaranteed a rich, fulfilling, challenging future for me. So why did I feel like I was looking around frantically for another way out? Why was I still waiting for some grand adventure to come and find me? I was drowning. Why did I recoil whenever anybody reached down to help me? The professors I talked to about it didn't seem concerned at all. They didn't get what the problem was. What should I do? Why? Anything I wanted to.
Meanwhile, Quentin and Alice plugged away at their mandatory senior theses with steadily diminishing enthusiasm. Alice was attempting to isolate an individual photon and freeze it in place, halting its headlong light-speed flight. She constructed an intricate trap for it out of wood and glass, interwoven with a hellishly complex spherical tangle of glowing indigo gramarye. But in the end, nobody was quite sure whether the photon was in there or not, and they couldn't figure out how to prove it one way or the other. Privately, Alice confessed to Quentin that she wasn't totally sure either, and she was genuinely hoping the faculty could settle it one way or the other, because it was driving her insane. After a week of increasingly fractious debate that settled nothing, they voted to give Alice the lowest possible passing grade and leave it at that.
Thoughtful for my project, I planned to fly to the moon and back. Distance-wise, I figured I could get there in a couple of days, straight shot, and after my Antarctic adventure, I was pretty solid on personal warmth spells. Though they weren't my discipline either. I'd just about given up on my discipline. And the idea had a certain romantic, lyrical savor to it. I took off from the sea on a bright, hot, humid spring morning with Alice and Gretchen and a couple of the more sycophantic new physical kids to see me off. The protection spells formed a clear bubble around me. Sounds became distorted, and the green lawn and the smiling faces of my well-wishers took on a surreal fisheye warp. As I rose, the earth gradually changed from an infinite matte plane below me to a radiant, bounded blue sphere. Overhead, the stars came out and became sharper and steelier and less twinkly. 6 hours into the trip, my throat suddenly clamped shut, and iron nails stabbed my eardrums. My eyeballs tried to pry themselves out of their sockets. I had drifted off, and my improvised space bubble had started to fail. I waved my arms like a frantic conductor, prestissimo, and the air thickened and warmed again. But by then, the fun had gone out of the whole thing. Bouts of shivering and wheezing and nervous laughter rattled me, and I couldn't calm down. Jesus, I thought, was there ever anything less worth risking my life for than this? God knows how much interstellar radiation I'd already absorbed. Space was full of angry little particles. I reversed course. I considered hiding out for a few days and just pretending I'd gone to the moon. Maybe I could score some moon dust off Lovelady, present it as evidence. The air got warmer again. The sky grew lighter. I relaxed as a cocktail of relief and shame filled me, one generous part of each. The world spread out again underneath me. The fractally detailed coastline, the blue water textured like beaten metal, the beckoning claw of Cape Cod. The worst part turned out to be walking into the Great Hall for dinner that night, 2 days early, with a sheepish, "Yeah, I fucked up" grin plastered on my face, which was sunburned a flaming red. After dinner, I borrowed Alice's key and retreated to the prefect's common room, where I drank too much sherry, sipping it alone in front of the darkened window, even though all I could see was my own reflection. Picturing the Hudson River moving past in the darkness, sluggish and swollen with cold spring rain. Alice was studying up in her room. Everybody else was asleep except for a lone weeknight party that was racketing on in one wing, spinning off drunk students in pairs and groups. When I was thoroughly smashed on self-pity and alcohol and the dawn was threatening to leap up at me at any moment, I walked gingerly back to my bedroom, climbing the spiral steps past what used to be Elliot's room. I weaved a little bit, swigging directly from the sherry bottle, which I'd liberated on my way out. I felt my intoxication already turning into a hangover, that queasy neurological alchemy that usually happens during sleep. My abdomen was overfull, swollen with tainted viscera. People I'd betrayed came wandering out from the place in my mind where they usually stayed. My parents, James, Julia, Professor March, Amanda Orloff, even old dead Mr. What's-his-name, my Princeton interviewer. They all watched me dispassionately. I was beneath their contempt. I lay down on my bed with the light on. Wasn't there a spell for making yourself happy? Somebody must have invented one. How could I have missed it? Why didn't they teach it? Was it in the library? A flying book fluttering just out of reach, beating its wings against some high window. I felt the bed slipping down and away, like a film loop of a stupid shearing down into an attack run, over and over again. I'd been so young when I first came here. I thought about that freezing day in November when I'd taken the book from the lovely paramedic and the note had blown away into that dry, twisted, frozen garden and I'd gone blithely running after it. Now I'd never know what it said. Had it contained all the riches, all the good feeling that I was still somehow missing, even after so much goodness had been heaped upon me? Was it the secret revelation of Martin Chatwin? The boy who had escaped into Fillory and never returned to face the misery of this world? Because I was drunk, I thought about my mother, and how she'd held me once when I was little after I'd lost an action figure down a storm drain, and I smooshed my red, smarting face into my cool pillow and sobbed as if my heart were broken.
By then, there were only 2 weeks left until graduation, classwork ground to a halt. The maze was a vivid, verdant, glowing green knot. The air was full of floaty little motes, and siren-like pleasure craft came drifting down the river past the boathouse, laden with oblivious sunbathers. All anybody talked about was how great it would be when they could party and sleep in and experiment with forbidden spells. They kept looking at each other and laughing and slapping each other on the back and shaking their heads. The carousel was slowing down. The music had almost stopped. Pranks were organized. A decadent, last days of Pompeii vibe swept through the dorms. Somebody thought up a new game involving dice and a lightly enchanted mirror that was basically a magical version of strip poker. Desperate, ill-advised attempts were made to sleep with that one person with whom one had always secretly, hopelessly wanted to sleep. The graduation ceremony started at 6 in the afternoon, with the sky still heavy with fading golden light. An 11-course banquet was served in the dining hall. The 19 graduating fifth years regarded one another with awe, feeling lost and alone at the long, empty dining table. Red wine was served from bottles without labels. It was made, fog revealed, using grapes from Brakebills' own tiny pocket vineyard, which Quentin had stumbled on in the fall of his first year. Traditionally, the vineyard's entire output was drunk by the seniors at graduation dinner, had to be drunk, Fogg stressed, hinting darkly at what would happen if a single bottle was left unconsumed. It was a Cabernet Sauvignon and it was thin and sour, but they quaffed it lustily anyway. Quentin declaimed a lengthy tribute to its subtle expression of the unique Brakebills terroir. Toast were drunk to the memory of Amanda Orloff, and the glasses hurled into the fireplace to ensure that no lesser toast would ever be drunk from them. When the wind blew, the candles flickered and dropped molten beeswax onto the fresh white tablecloth. Along with the cheese course, they were each presented with a silver bee pin, identical to the ones the prefects wore. Quentin was at a loss to imagine any occasion on which it would be even remotely appropriate to wear it, and a heavy black two-toothed iron key that would permit them to return to Brakebills if they ever needed to. School songs were sung, and Chambers served scotch, which Quentin had never had before. He tipped his little tumbler of it from side to side, watching the light drift through this mysterious amber fluid. It was amazing that anything in liquid form could taste that much, like both smoke and fire. He leaned over to Georgia and started to explain this fascinating conundrum to her, but as he did so, Fogg stood up at the head of the table, strangely grave, dismissed Chambers, and asked the fifth years to follow him downstairs. This was unexpected. Downstairs meant the cellar, where Quentin had almost never been in his whole time at Brakebills, just once or twice to sneak a particularly coveted bottle from the wine cellar or when he and Alice had been desperate for privacy. But now Professor Fogg led them in a loose, bantering, occasionally singing flock back through the kitchen, to a small, unassuming door in the pantry, and down a flight of worn and dusty wooden stairs that changed mid-flight into stone. They emerged into a dark, earthy sub-basement. This wasn't where Quentin had thought the party was going. It wasn't a party atmosphere at all. It was cool down here and suddenly quiet. The floor was dirt, the ceilings were low, and the walls were bumpy and unfinished. They devoured sound. Voice by voice, the chorus of a traditional Brakebills song, an elaborately euphemistic number entitled, "The Prefect Has a Defect Died Away." There was a grave but not unpleasant smell of damp soil. Fogg stopped at what looked like a manhole cover embedded in the dirt floor. It was brass and densely inscribed with calligraphic writing. Oddly, it looked as shiny and new as a freshly struck coin. The dean picked up a heavy manhole tool and, with an effort, levered up the brass disc. It was 2 inches thick, and it took 3 of the fifth years to roll it to one side.
After you.
He gestured grandly at the inky black hole. Quentin went first. He felt around blindly with his scotch-venomed feet till he found an iron rung. It was like lowering himself into warm black oil. The ladder took him and the other graduates straight down into a circular chamber, large enough for all 19 of them to stand upright, in a circle, which they did. Fogg came down last. They could hear him screwing the manhole cover back into place behind them. Then he descended too, and with a crash he sent the ladder retracting back up, like a fire escape. After that, the silence was absolute.
No point in losing our momentum.
He lit a candle and gamely produced 2/5 of bourbon from somewhere and set them going in opposite directions around the circle. Something about this gesture unnerved Quentin. There was a certain amount of sanctioned alcohol consumption at Brakebills. A fairly large amount, really, but this was a bit much. There was something forced about it.
Thoughtful well, it was graduation. We weren't students anymore. We were grown-ups. Just peers, sharing a drink, in a secret underground dungeon, in the middle of the night. I took my swig and passed it on.
Dean Fogg lit more candles in assorted brass candlesticks, making a circle within their larger circle. They couldn't have been more than 50 yards down, but it felt like they were a solid mile beneath the earth, entombed alive, forgotten by the rest of the world.
In case you're wondering why we're down here, it's because I wanted to get us outside the Brakebills' protective cordon. That's a defensive magical barrier that extends out from the house in all directions. That inscribed brass hatch we opened was a gateway through it. It's a little unsettling, yes, but it's appropriate, because unlike me, you'll be spending the rest of your lives out here. Most years, the point of coming down here is to scare you with ghost stories about the outside world. In your case, I don't think that will be necessary. You've witnessed firsthand the destructive power that some magical entities possess. It's unlikely you'll ever see anything as bad as what happened on the day of the beast. But remember that what happened that day can happen again. Those of you who were in the auditorium that day, especially, will carry the mark of it forever. You will never forget the beast, and you can be sure it won't forget you either. Forgive me if I lecture you, but it's the last chance I'm going to get.
Quentin was sitting opposite Fogg in the circle. They had all taken seats on the smooth stone floor, and his mild, clean-shaven face floated in the darkness like an apparition. Both bottles of whiskey reached Quentin simultaneously, and he gamely took a sip from each, one in each hand, and passed them on.
Sometimes I wonder if man was really meant to discover magic. It doesn't really make sense. It's a little too perfect, don't you think? If there's a single lesson that life teaches us, it's that wishing doesn't make it so. Words and thoughts don't change anything. Language and reality are kept strictly apart. Reality is tough, unyielding stuff, and it doesn't care what you think or feel or say about it. Or it shouldn't. You deal with it, and you get on with your life. But little children don't know that. Magical thinking, that's what Freud called it. Once we learn otherwise, we cease to be children. The separation of word and thing is the essential fact on which our adult lives are founded. But somewhere in the heat of magic, that boundary between word and thing ruptures. It cracks, and the one flows back into the other, and the two melt together and fuse. Language gets tangled up with the world it describes. And thoughtful, I sometimes feel as though we've stumbled on a flaw in the system, don't you? A short circuit? A category error? A strange loop? Is it possible that magic is knowledge that would be better off forsworn? Tell me this. Can a man who can cast a spell ever really grow up?
He paused. No one answered. What the hell would they say? It was a little late to be scolding them now that they'd already completed their magical education.
I have a little theory that I'd like to air here, if I may. What is it that you think makes you magicians? Is it because you are intelligent? Is it because you are brave and good? Is it because you're special? Maybe. Who knows? But I'll tell you something. I think you're magicians because you're unhappy. A magician is strong because he feels pain. He feels the difference between what the world is and what he would make of it. Or what did you think that stuff in your chest was? A magician is strong because he hurts more than others. His wound is his strength. Most people carry that pain around inside them their whole lives, until they kill the pain by other means, or until it kills them. But you, my friends, you found another way. A way to use the pain, to burn it as fuel for light and warmth. You have learned to break the world that has tried to break you.
My attention wandered to the tiny glimmery points of light here and there on the curved ceiling above them, pricking out the shapes of constellations I didn't recognize, as if we were on another planet, seeing the stars from an alien angle. Someone cleared his throat.
But just in case that's not enough, each one of you will leave this room tonight with an insurance policy. A pentagram tattooed on your back, 5-pointed star, nicely decorative, plus it acts as a holding cell for a demon, a small but rather vicious little fellow. Cacodemon, technically. They're tough little scrappers, skin like iron. In fact, I think they may be made of iron. I'll give you each a password that sets him free. Speak the password, and he'll pop out and fight for you till he's dead, or till whoever's giving you trouble is.
Fogg clapped his hands on his knees and looked at them as if he'd just told them they'd all be receiving a year's supply of attractive and useful Brakebills stationery. Georgia put up her hand tentatively.
Is this optional? I mean, is anybody else besides me disturbed by the idea of having an angry demon, trapped inside their skin?
If that bothers you, Georgia, then you should have gone to beauty school. Don't worry, he'll be grateful as hell, so to speak, when you set him free. He's only good for one fight, though, so pick your moment. That's the other reason we're down here, by the way. Can't conjure a cacodemon inside the cordon. Why we need the bourbon, too. 'Cause this is going to hurt like a bitch. Now, who's first? Or shall we go alphabetically?
The next morning at 10, there was a more conventional graduation ceremony in the largest and grandest of the lecture halls. It would be difficult to imagine a more miserable and visibly hungover group of graduating seniors. It was one of the rare occasions when parents were allowed on campus, so no displays of magic or mentions of same were allowed. Almost as bad as the hangover was the pain from the tattoo. Quinton's back felt like it was crawling with hungry, biting insects that had stumbled on something especially delicious. He was exquisitely conscious of his mother and father sitting a dozen rows behind him.
My memories of the night before were confused. The dean had summoned the demons himself, scribbling concentric rings of sigils on the old stone floor with thick chunks of white chalk. He worked quickly and surely, with both hands at once. For the tattooing, the guys took off their shirts and jackets and lined up naked to the waist, as did the girls, with varying degrees of modesty. Some of them clutched their crumpled clothes over their chests. A few exhibitionists stripped down proudly. In the half-darkness, I couldn't see what Fogg was using to draw on their skin, something slim and glinting. The designs were intricate and had strange, shifting, optical qualities. The pain was astonishing, like Fogg was flaying the skin off their backs and dressing the wounds with salt. But the pain was offset by the fear of what was coming. The moment when he implanted the demon, when they were all ready, Fogg built a low dome of loose glowing embers in the center of the sigil rings, and the room got hot and humid. Blood and smoke and sweat were in the air, and an orgiastic fever. When it was the first girl's turn going alphabetically, that was Alsop, Gretchen Fogg donned an iron gauntlet and rummaged around in the coals till he got a grip on something. The red glow lit up Fogg's face from below, and maybe it was just the distortions of memory and alcohol. But I thought I saw something there that I hadn't seen since my first day at Brakebills. Something drunken and cruel and unfatherly. When he had hold of what he was looking for, he heaved, and out of the embers it came. A demon, trailing sparks, heavy and dog-sized and pissed off. In the same motion, he crammed it wriggling into Gretchen's slender back. He had to go back and stuff one flailing, sticking out limb back in. She gasped. Her whole body tensed, like she'd had freezing water dumped over her. And then she just looked puzzled, twisting to look over her shoulder, forgetting for a second, and letting everyone see her slight, pale-nippled breasts. Because as I discovered when it was my turn, there was no sensation at all. Thoughtful, it all felt like a dream now, though of course the first thing I did that morning was check out my back in the mirror. There it was, a huge 5-pointed star in thick black outline, raw and red, and slightly off-center. To the left, I supposed it must be positioned more or less exactly with my heart at its center. Segments of the star were dense with fine squiggly black writing and smaller stars, and crescent moons and other less easily identifiable icons. I looked like I hadn't been so much tattooed as notarized or stamped like a passport. Tired, achy, and hungover as I was, I smiled at it in the mirror. The overall effect was completely badass.
When it was all over, they shuffled out of the auditorium into the old hallway. If they'd had caps, they might have thrown them in the air, but they didn't. There was a low hum of conversation, a couple of whoops, but that was really it. It was over. There was nothing else. If they hadn't been graduated last night, they sure were now. They could go anywhere, do anything they wanted. This was it, the big send-off. Alice and Quentin drifted out a side door and wandered over to a huge spreading oak, swinging their held hands between them. There was no wind. The sunlight was too bright. Quentin's head throbbed. His parents were in the vicinity, and he'd have to go look for them in a second. Or maybe they could come looking for him for once in their lives. There would be parties tonight, he supposed, but he was already pretty much partied out. He didn't feel like packing up his things, didn't feel like going back to Chesterton, or Brooklyn, or anywhere else for that matter. He didn't feel like staying, and he didn't feel like going. He stole a glance at Alice. She looked piqued. He performed a mental search for the love he was accustomed to feel for her, and found it strangely absent. Was entitled The Magicians, cast by our Tale Studio. Please subscribe to our channel if you enjoy listening. Anything he wanted at that moment, it was to be alone. But he wasn't going to get that.
Worried these were bad thoughts, but he couldn't or wouldn't stop the flow, stanch the cerebral hemorrhage. Here he was, a freshly licensed and bonded and accredited magician. He had learned to cast spells, seen the beast, and lived, flown to Antarctica on his own 2 wings, and returned naked by the sheer force of his magical will. He had an iron demon in his back. Who would ever have thought he could do, and have, and be all those things, and still feel nothing at all? What was he missing? Or was it him? If he wasn't happy even here, even now, did the flaw lie in him? As soon as he seized happiness, it dispersed and reappeared somewhere else. Like Fillory, like everything good, it never lasted. What a terrible thing to know. I got my heart's desire, he thought, and there my troubles began.
We have our whole lives ahead of us, and all I want to do is take a nap.
Quentin turned around and they were all there. Josh with a fringe of blonde beard that made him look more than ever like a genial smiling abbot. Janet had gotten her nose pierced and probably other parts of her. Elliot wore sunglasses, which he had never done at Brakebills, and a shirt of amazing, indescribable perfection. There was somebody else with them, too. A stranger. A serious, slightly older man, tall and darkly, bookishly handsome.
Get your stuff together. We're going to take you away from all this.
Haparo dona bara, haparo dona bara. Neutral Manhattan. 2 months later, it was November. Not Brakebills November. Real November. Quentin had to keep reminding himself that they were on regular real-world time now. He lolled his temple against the cold apartment window. Far below, he could see a neat little rectangular park where the trees were red and brown. The grass was threadbare with dirt patches, like a worn-out rug with the canvas backing showing through the woven surface. Quentin and Alice lay on their backs on a wide candy-striped daybed by the window, limply holding hands, looking and feeling like they'd just washed ashore on a raft that had been limply deposited by the surf on the beach of a silent, deserted island. The lights were off, but milky white afternoon sunlight filtered into the room through half-closed blinds. The remains of a game of chess, a sloppy, murderous draw, lay on a nearby coffee table. The apartment was undecorated and barely furnished except for an eclectic collection they trucked in as the need arose. They were squatting, A tiresomely complex magical arrangement had allowed them to secure this particular scrap of underutilized Lower East Side real estate while its rightful owners were otherwise occupied. A deep, thick silence hung in the still air, like stiff white sheets on a clothesline. Nobody spoke, and nobody had spoken for about an hour, and nobody felt the need to speak. They were in Lotus Land.
2. Past 2. 2.
Neither of them moved.
Neutral. It's probably Elliot. Probably.
He didn't tell me you were going early.
Quentin sat up slowly, using just his stomach muscles, at the same time extracting his arm from beneath Alice's head.
Neutral. I'm probably going early.
He buzzed Elliot in. They were going to a party.
Thoughtful it was only 2 months since graduation, but already Brakebills seemed like a lifetime ago. Yet another lifetime, Quentin thought, reflecting world-wearily that at the age of 21, he was already on his 3rd or 4th lifetime. When he left Brakebills for New York, Quentin had expected to be knocked down and ravished by the sheer gritty reality of it all. Going from the jeweled chrysalis of Brakebills to the big, messy, dirty city where real people led real lives in the real world and did real work for real money. And for a couple of weeks he had been. It was definitely real. If by real you meant non-magical and obsessed with money and amazingly filthy. He had completely forgotten what it was like to be in the mundane world all the time. Nothing was enchanted. Everything was what it was, and nothing more. Thoughtful, every conceivable surface was plastered with words, concert posters, billboards, graffiti, maps, signs, warning labels, alternate side parking regulations, but none of it meant anything, not the way a spell did. At Brakebills, every square inch of the house, every brick, every bush, every tree had been marinated in magic for centuries. Here, out in the world, raw, unmodified physics reigned, and mundanity was epidemic. It was like a coral reef with the living vital meaning, bleached out of it, leaving nothing but an empty colored rock behind. To a magician's eyes, Manhattan looked like a desert. Neutral, though like a desert, it did have some stunted, twisted traces of life if you dug for them. There was a magical culture in New York outside the handful of Brakebills' educated elite who resided there, but it existed on the city's immigrant margins. The older physical kids, a name they had left behind at Brakebills and would never use again, gave Quentin and Alice the Outer Borough subway tour. In a windowless second-story cafe on Queens Boulevard, they watched Kazakhs and Hasidim construe number theory. They ate dumplings with Korean mystics in Flushing and watched modern-day ISIS worshippers rehearse Egyptian street hexes in the back of a bodega on Atlantic Avenue. Once they took the ferry across to Staten Island, where they stood around a dazzlingly blue swimming pool sipping gin and tonics at a conclave of Filipino shamans. Thoughtful. But after a few weeks, the energy for those educational field trips had all but evaporated. There was just too much to distract them, and nothing particularly urgent to be distracted from. Magic would always be there, and it was hard work, and he'd been doing it for a long time. What Quentin needed to catch up on was life. New York's magical underground may have been limited, but the number and variety of its drinking establishments was prodigious. And you could get drugs here, actual drugs. They had all the power in the world, and no work to do, and nobody to stop them. They ran riot through the city. Worried Alice didn't find all this quite as exciting as Quentin did. She had put off the kind of civil service appointment or research apprenticeship that usually ensnared serious-minded Brakebills students, so she could stay in New York with Quentin and the others. But, in spite of that, she showed signs of actual unfeigned academic curiosity, which caused her to spend a good part of every day studying magic instead of, for example, recovering from having gone out the night before. Quentin felt mildly ashamed for not following her example. Enough that he even made noises about relaunching his failed lunar expedition, but not so much that he actually did anything about it. Alice cycled through a sequence of space travel-related nicknames for him. Scotty, Major Tom. Like O'Toole, his lack of progress began to make them more humiliating than funny. He felt entitled to blow off steam and shake off the Brakebills' pixie dust and generally live. And Elliot felt that way too. It wasn't a problem. He and Alice were just different people. Isn't that what made it interesting? Thoughtful at any rate, Quentin felt interesting. He felt fascinating. For the first year after graduation, his financial needs were taken care of by an immense secret slush fund, amassed covertly over the centuries through magically augmented investing, that yielded a regular allowance for all newly minted magicians who needed it, After 4 cloistered years at Brakebills, cash was like a magic all its own. A way of turning one thing into another thing, producing something out of nothing. And he worked that magic all over town. Money people thought he was artsy. Artsy people thought he was money. And everybody thought he was clever and good looking. And he got invited everywhere. Charity social events, underground poker clubs, dive bars, rooftop parties, mobile all-night in-limo narcotics binges. Neutral he and Elliot passed themselves off as brothers, and their double act was the hit of the season. It was the revenge of the nerds. Night after night, Quentin would return home toward dawn, alone, deposited in front of his building by a solemn, solitary cab, like a hearse painted yellow, the street awash with blue light, the delicate ultrasound radiance of the embryonic day. Coming down off coke or ecstasy, his body felt strange and heavy, like a golem fashioned from some ultra-dense star metal that had fallen from the sky and cooled and congealed into human form. He felt so heavy that he could break through the brittle pavement any second and plunge down into the sewers, unless he placed his feet gently and precisely in the center of each sidewalk square in turn. Standing alone amid the still, stately mess of their apartment, his heart would brim over with regret. He felt like his life had gone terribly wrong. He shouldn't have gone out. He should have stayed home with Alice. But he would have been so bored if he'd stayed home, and she would have been bored if she'd come out. What were they going to do? They couldn't go on like this. He felt so grateful to her for not having seen the excesses he had so eagerly indulged in, the drugs he had ingested, the manic flirting and pawing in which he had engaged. Thoughtful, then he would take off his clothes, which reeked of cigarette smoke, like a toad shedding its skin, and Alice would stir sleepily in the sheets and sit up, the white sheet slipping down off her heavy breasts. She would lean against him, their backs against the cool white wooden curl of their sleigh bed, not speaking, and they would watch as the dawn came up and a garbage truck moved haltingly down the block, its pneumatic biceps gleaming as it greedily consumed whatever its overall attendants flung into it, ingesting what the city had expectorated. And Quentin would feel a lofty pity for the garbagemen, and for all the straights and civilians. He wondered what they could possibly have in their uncharmed lives that made them think they were worth living.
He heard Elliot try the door, find it locked, and fumble around for his key. Elliot shared an apartment with Janet in Soho, but he was over at Quentin and Alice's so much that it was easier just to give him his own key. Quentin strolled around the open-plan apartment, half-heartedly straightening up, snapping up condom wrappers and underwear, and decaying food and depositing them in the trash. It was a beautiful place in a converted factory, all wide-planked, thickly varnished wood floors and arched warehouse windows, but it had seen more considerate tenants. He'd been surprised to discover when they moved in together that, while he was an indifferent housekeeper, Alice was the true slob of the relationship. She retreated to the bedroom to get dressed. She was still in her nightgown. Ha ha ha! Although it wasn't, he loitered just inside the rolling metal freight door, wearing a long overcoat and a sweater that had been expensive before moths got to it.
Neutral, hey! Just let me grab my coat.
Freezing out there. Is Alice coming?
I didn't get that impression. Alice.
Thoughtful, there was no answer. Elliot had already faded back out into the hall. He didn't seem to have much patience for Alice lately as somebody who didn't share his rigorous dedication to pleasure-seeking. Quentin supposed her unfussy diligence reminded him unpleasantly of the future he was ignoring. Quentin knew it had that effect on him. He hesitated on the threshold, torn between conflicting loyalties. She would probably be grateful for some quiet time to study.
I think she's coming later. Okay, bye! I'll see you there.
There was no answer.
Bye, Mom.
And thoughtful, like everything else, Elliot was different in New York. At Brakebills, he had always been supremely aloof and self-sufficient. His personal charm and odd appearance and talent for magic had raised him up and set him apart. But since Quentin had joined him in Manhattan, the balance of power between them had shifted somehow. Elliot hadn't survived transplantation unscathed. He no longer floated easily above the fray. His humor was more arch and bitter and childish than Quentin remembered. He seemed to be getting younger as Quentin got older. He needed Quentin more, and he resented Quentin for that. He hated to be left out of anything, and he hated to be included in anything. Worried he spent more time than he should have on the roof of his apartment building smoking his merits, and God knows what else, there wasn't much you couldn't find if you had the money, and they had the money. He was getting too thin. He was depressed and turned nasty when Quentin tried to jolly him out of it. When annoyed, he was fond of saying, "God, it's amazing I'm not a dipsomaniac," and then correcting himself. Oh, wait, that's right. It had been funny the first time. Sort of. Thoughtful that Brakebills Elliot had started drinking at dinner time, earlier on weekends, which was fine, because all the upperclassmen drank at dinner, though not all of them bartered their desserts for extra glasses of wine the way Elliot did. In Manhattan, with no professors watching over them and no classes to be sober for, Elliot was rarely without a glass of something in his hand from 1 in the afternoon on. Usually it was something relatively innocuous, white wine or Campari or a big dilute tumbler of bourbon and soda clunking with ice. But still, once when Elliot was nursing a stubborn cold, Quentin remarked lightly that maybe he should consider something more wholesome than a vodka tonic with which to chase his plastic jigger of Dayquil.
I'm sick. I'm not dead.
Neutral. And that was that.
At least one of Elliot's talents had survived graduation. He was still a tireless seeker out of obscure and wonderful bottles of wine. He was not yet such a lush that he'd abandoned his snobbishness. He went to tastings and chatted up importers and wine store owners with a zeal that he mustered from nothing else. Once every few weeks, when he had accumulated a dozen or so bottles of which he was especially proud, Elliot would announce that they were having a dinner party. It was one such dinner party that he and Quentin were preparing for today. They lavished a ridiculous amount of effort on these parties, all out of proportion to any actual fun they might get in return. The venue was always Elliot and Janet's Soho apartment, a vast pre-war warren with an implausible profusion of bedrooms, a set ripe for a French farce. Josh was head chef, with Quentin assisting as apprentice chef and kitchen runner. Elliot acted as sommelier, of course. Alice's contribution was to stop reading long enough to eat. Janet dressed the set, she formulated the night's dress code, chose the music, and hand-wrote and illustrated amazingly beautiful one-off menus. She also confabulated various surreal and sometimes controversial centerpieces. The theme of tonight's party was miscegenation, and Janet had promised over objections aesthetic, moral, and ornithological to deliver Lita and the Swan staged as a pair of magically animated ice sculptures. They would copulate until they melted. As with all such evenings, the cleverness of the conceit became annoying somewhere around the middle of the afternoon before the party actually started. Quentin had found a grass skirt in an antique store which he planned to pair with a tuxedo shirt and jacket, but the skirt was so scratchy that he gave up on it. He couldn't think of another idea, so he spent the rest of the afternoon brooding and dodging Josh, who had spent the past week researching recipes that included violently disparate ingredients wedded together, sweet and savory, black and white, frozen and molten, eastern and western, and was now frantically slamming oven and cabinet doors and making him taste things and sniping at him over the pastry island. Alice arrived at 5:30, and Quentin and Josh both dodged her as well. By the time the party started, everybody was drunk and starving and irritable. But then, as sometimes happens with dinner parties, everything became mysteriously, spontaneously perfect again. The fabric knitted itself back together. The day before, Josh, who by this time had shaved off his beard, it's like taking care of a damn pet, announced that he was bringing a date which put added pressure on everybody to get their shit together. As the sun set over the Hudson, and sunbeams tinted a delicate rose by their passage through the atmosphere over New Jersey lanced through the apartment's huge common room, and Elliot handed around little cocktails, little and champagne layered over a velvet hammer of vodka, in chilled martini glasses, and Quentin served miniature sweet and sour lobster rolls, everybody suddenly seemed, or maybe they actually were. Josh had refused to reveal the identity of his date in advance, so when the elevator doors opened, they had the entire floor. Quentin had no idea that he would recognize her. It was the girl from Luxembourg, the curly-haired captain of the European team that had administered the death blow to his welter's career. It turned out they told the story collaboratively, a set piece they'd evidently been working on, that Josh had bumped into her in a subway station where she was trying to bewitch a vending machine into adding money to her Metro card. Her name was Anai, and she wore a pair of snakeskin pants so ravishing that nobody asked her what, if anything, they had to do with the theme. She had blonde ringlets and a tiny pointy nose, and Josh was obviously besotted with her. So was Quentin. He felt a wild pang of jealousy. He barely talked to Alice all night anyway, what with ducking in and out of the kitchen, warming and plating and serving things. By the time he emerged with the entree's pork chops dusted with bitter chocolate, it was dark, and Richard was making a speech about magical theory. The wine and the food and the music and the candles were almost enough to make what he was saying seem interesting. Richard, of course, was the mysterious stranger who turned up with the other former physical kids on graduation day. He was a one-time physical kid, too, of the generation that preceded Elliot and Josh and Janet, and of them all he was the only one who had actually entered the world of respectable professional wizardry. Richard was tall, with a big head, dark hair, square shoulders, and a big square chin, and he was handsome in a Frankensteinian way. He was friendly enough to Quentin firm handshake, lots of eye contact with his big dark eyes. In conversation, he liked to address Quentin directly as Quentin a lot, which made him feel kind of like they were having a job interview. Richard was employed by the trust that managed the collective financial assets of the magical community, which were vast. He was, in a quiet way, an observant Christian. They were rare among magicians.
Quentin tried to like Richard, since everybody else did, and it would just be simpler. But he was so damn earnest. He wasn't stupid, but he completely lacked any sense of humor. Jokes derailed him, so that the whole conversation had to stop while somebody, usually Janet, explained what everybody else was laughing at, and Richard knitted his thick Vulcan eyebrows in consternation at his companion's merely human foibles. And Janet, who could usually be counted on to ruthlessly flence anybody who made the mistake of taking anything seriously, Janet waited on Richard hand and foot. It annoyed Quentin to think that she might look up to Richard the same way he had once looked up to the older physical kids. He had the definite sense that Janet must have slept with Richard once or twice back at Brakebills. It was entirely possible that they slept together once in a while now.
Thoughtful magic is the tools of the maker. There's no other way of looking at it. We are dealing with a scenario where there is a person who built the house and then he left. And when he left his tools lying around the garage. Then we found them and we picked them up and we started making guesses about how they work. Now we're learning to use them. And that's magic.
There are so many things wrong with that. I don't even know where to start.
So, start!
Quentin put down the food he was carrying. He had no idea what he was about to say, but he was happy to be publicly contradicting Richard.
Thoughtful. Okay, well, first of all, there's a huge scale problem. Nobody's building universes here. We're not even building galaxies or solar systems or planets. You need cranes and bulldozers to build a house. If there is a maker, which I frankly don't see much evidence for, that's what he had. What we've got are hand tools. Black & Decker. I don't see how you get from there to what you're talking about.
That thoughtful. If it's a question of scale, I don't see that as insurmountable. Maybe we're just not. We're not plugging our tools into the right socket. Maybe there's a much bigger socket tot.
I think if you're talking about electricity, you have to talk about where energy comes from.
Thoughtful. That's what I should have said. Alice relished theoretical arguments as much as Richard, and she was much better at them.
You're demonstrably drawing energy from one place and putting it in another. If somebody created the universe, they actually created energy from somewhere. They didn't just push it around. Plus, magic just doesn't feel like a tool. Can you imagine how boring it would be if casting a spell were like turning on an electric drill? But it's not. It's irregular and beautiful. It's not an artifact. It's something else, something organic. It feels like a grown thing, not a made thing.
Thoughtful, she looked radiant in a silky black sheath that she knew he liked. Where had she been all night? He seemed to keep forgetting what a treasure she was.
I bet it's alien tech. Or fourth dimensional, like weather or something. From a direction we can't even see. Or we're in some kind of really high-tech multiplayer video game, so... That's why Elliot's always humping my corpse.
Not necessarily. It's not necessarily irregular, or I would argue that it partakes of a higher regularity, a higher order that we haven't been allowed to see.
Yeah, that's the answer. That's the answer to everything. God save us from Christian magicians. You sound just like my parents. That is just exactly what my ignorant Christian parents would say. Just, if it doesn't fit with your theory, well, that's just because, oh, it actually does, but God is mysterious, so we can't see it, because we're so sinful. That's so fucking easy.
Huey fished around in the remnants of Janet's centerpiece with a long serving fork. Lita and the swan were indistinguishable from each other. Now, two rounded bronchusi forms still gamely humping away as a tide of slush rose up to drown them.
Well, heck, we ought to call ourselves the metaphysical kids.
And who the fuck is this maker you're talking about? Are you talking about God? Because if you're talking about God, just say God.
All right. Let's say God.
She.
Is this a moral God? Is he going to punish us for using his holy magic? For being bad little magicians? Is he going to come back and give us a good spanking because we got into the garage and played with Daddy's power tools? Because that is just stupid. It's just stupid, and it's ignorant. No one gets punished for anything. We do whatever we want, and that's all we do. And nobody stops us, and nobody cares.
If he left us his tools, he left them for a reason.
And I suppose you know what that is.
What's the next whine, Elliot?
She always kept a cool head in difficult moments, maybe because she tended to be so out of control so much of the rest of the time. She looked unusually ravishing tonight, too, in a slinky red tunic that made it to her mind, barely before it gave out. The kind of thing Alice would never wear, couldn't not with her figure. Both Richard and Elliot seemed to want to extend the fight by another round, but Elliot, with an effort of will, allowed himself to be diverted.
An excellent question. I am receiving a divine vision from the almighty maker of an exquisitely expensive small batch bourbon, which God, I'm sorry, the makeress has commanded me to render unto you forthwith.
He stood up unsteadily and lurched in the direction of the kitchen. Quentin found him sitting red-faced and sweating on a stool by an open window. Icy air was pouring in, but Elliot didn't seem to notice. He stared out unblinking at the city, which receded in perspectival lines of lights fanning out into the blackness. He said nothing. He didn't move as Quentin helped Richard manage the individual baked Alaskas. The trick, Richard explained, in his well-practiced explaining tone, was to make sure the meringue, an excellent heat insulator, formed a complete seal over the ice cream core, and Quentin wondered if they'd lost Elliot for the evening. It wouldn't be the first time he drank himself out of contention, but a few minutes later he rallied and trailed them back into the dining room with a slender, oddly shaped bottle sloshing with amber-colored whiskey. Things were winding down. Everyone was treading carefully so as not to trigger another outburst from Elliot or another sermon from Richard. Not long afterward, Josh left to take Anias home, and Richard retired of his own accord, leaving Quentin, Janet, and Elliot to preside woozily over the empty bottles and crumpled napkins. One of the candles had charred a hole in the tablecloth. Where was Alice? Had she gone home? Or crashed in one of the spare rooms? He tried her cell. No answer. Elliot had dragged a pair of ottomans over to the table. He reclined on them Roman style, though they were too low, so he had to reach up to get his drink, and all Quentin could see of him was his groping hand. Janet lay down too, spooned up contentedly behind him.
Neutral. Cheese. Do we have cheese? I need cheese.
Worried? On cue, Peggy Lee wandered through the opening verse of Is That All There Is? On the stereo. Which would be worse, Quentin wondered. If Richard was right, and there was an angry moral God, or if Elliot was right, and there was no point at all, if magic was created for a purpose, or if they could do whatever they wanted with it. Something like a panic attack came over him, they were really in trouble out here. There was nothing to hang on to. They couldn't go on like this forever. There's a Morbiere in the kitchen. It was supposed go with the theme, the 2 layers, the morning milking, the night milking.
Yeah, we get it. Fetch Q. Go on.
I'll go. Ha! And instead of standing up, he just rolled weakly off the couch and fell on the floor. But he was laughing as Quentin and Janet picked him up, Quentin getting his shoulders and Janet taking his feet, all thoughts of cheese extinguished, and maneuvered him out of the dining room and in the direction of his bedroom. On their way out the door, Elliot's head hit the doorframe with another loud bonk, and then it was just too absolutely hilarious. And they all started laughing, and they laughed until they were completely useless, and Janet dropped his feet, and Quentin dropped his shoulders, and his head bonked on the floor again, and by this time it was 1,000 times more funny than the first 2 times. It took Quentin and Janet 20 minutes to get Elliot down the hall to his bedroom, lurching heavily against the walls with their arms around each other as if they were struggling down a flooded steerage-level corridor on the Titanic. The world had become smaller and somehow lighter. Nothing meant anything but what was meaning anyway, but a burden that weighed them down. Elliot kept saying he was fine, and Quentin and Janet kept insisting they had to pick him up. Janet announced that she had peed herself, actually literally peed herself. She was laughing so hard.
I am the mighty maker, and I now bequeath to you my holy power tools, because I am too fucking drunk to use them anymore, and good luck to you, because when I get up tomorrow, They had better be exactly where I left them. Exactly. Especially my belt sander, because I am going to be so fucking hungover tomorrow. Anybody who fucks with my belt sander is going to get a taste of my belt. And it won't taste good. At all.
Finally, they heaved him onto his bed and tried to make him drink water and pulled up the covers over his chest.
And thoughtful. It could have been the sheer domesticity of it. It was as if Elliot were their beloved son, whom they were lovingly tucking in for the night, or maybe it was just boredom, that powerful aphrodisiac which had never been entirely out of sight, even during the party's best moments. But if he was honest with himself, Quentin had known for at least 20 minutes, even as they were wrestling Elliot down the hall, that he was going to take Janet's dress off as soon as he had half a chance.
Quentin woke up slowly the next morning, so slowly over such a long time that he was never really sure he'd been asleep at all. The bed felt unstable and disconcertingly floaty, and it was weird with two other naked people there. They kept bumping into each other and inadvertently touching and pulling away, and then feeling self-conscious about having pulled away.
Thoughtful. At first, in the first flush of it, he felt no regret about what happened. It was what you were supposed to do. He was living life to the fullest, getting drunk and giving in to forbidden passions. That was the stuff of life. Wasn't that the lesson of the foxes? If Alice had any blood in her veins, she would have joined them. But no, she had to go to bed early. She was just like Richard. Well, welcome to life in the grown-up magical world, Alice. Magic wasn't going to solve everything. Couldn't she see that? Couldn't she see that they were all dying, that everything was futile, that the only thing to do was to live and drink and fuck whatever and whomever while you still could? She herself had warned him of that, right there in her parents' house in Illinois. And she'd been right. And then after a while, it seemed like a debatable thing. You could really make the case both ways. It was a coin flip. And then it was an unfortunate lapse, an indiscretion, still within the bounds of the forgivable, but definitely a low point, not a personal best. And then it was a major indiscretion, a bad mistake. And then, in the last act of the striptease, it revealed itself to be what it truly was, a terrible, really awful, hurtful betrayal.
Worried at some point during this slow, incremental fall from grace, Quentin became aware of Alice sitting at the foot of the bed, just her back, facing away from where he and Janet and Elliot lay, resting her chin in her hands. Periodically, he imagined that it was just a dream, that she hadn't been there at all. But to be honest, he was pretty sure she had. She hadn't looked like a figment. She'd been fully dressed. She must have been up for a while. Around 9 o'clock, the room was full of morning light, and Quentin couldn't pretend to be asleep anymore. He sat up. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and he couldn't remember where his shirt was. He wasn't wearing anything else either. He would have given anything right then just to have a shirt and some underwear. With his bare feet on the hardwood floor, he felt strangely insubstantial. He couldn't understand, couldn't quite believe what he'd done. It just didn't seem like him.
Maybe Fogg was right. Maybe magic had inhibited his moral development. Something must have. Maybe that was why he was such a shit. But there had to be a way he could make Alice understand how sorry he was. He dragged a blanket off Elliot's bed. Janet stirred and complained sleepily, then went back to her dreamless, guiltless sleep, and wrapped it around himself and padded out into the silent apartment. The dinner table was like a shipwreck. The kitchen looked like a crime scene. Their little planet was ruined, and there was nowhere left for him to stand. Quentin thought about Professor Mayakovsky, how he'd reversed time, fixed the glass globe, brought the spider back to life. That would be a pretty nice thing to be able to do right about now.
When the elevator doors pinged open, Quentin thought it must be Josh coming back from a successful night with a NAS. Instead, it was Penny, pale and breathing hard from running and so excited he could barely contain himself. Neutral, people, wool and neutral, dieste, O-R-Y. He had a new mohawk, a proud iridescent green ruff an inch wide and 3 inches high like the crest of a centurion's helmet. He had also gained weight. He looked oddly, younger and softer than he had at Brakebills, less like a lone Iroquois warrior and more like an overfed white suburban gangsta. But it was still Penny who was catching his breath on the oriental rug and looking around at everything like a curious, judgmental rabbit. He wore a black leather jacket with chrome spikes on it, faded black jeans, and a grubby white t-shirt.
Jesus. Do they even have punks anymore? He must be the last one in New York.
Penny sniffed and wiped his nose on his sleeve. Neither of them spoke. Quentin knew enough to know that Penny would never stoop to petty social pleasantries like saying hello and asking how he'd been and explaining what the hell he was doing here. Just this once, Quentin was grateful. He didn't know if he could face it.
Neutral, how'd you get in here?
Your doorman was asleep. You should really fire him.
It's not my doorman. You must have cast something.
Neutral, just Cholmondeley's stealth.
Elliot has a ward on this whole floor. I helped him set it up. Plus, you need a key for the elevator.
We'll need to set a new ward. I unpicked it on the way up.
Fucking okay. First, who's we? We who? And second, Penny? Jesus, it took us a whole weekend to put up that ward.
He did a quick check. Penny was right. The defensive spells around the apartment were gone, so gone that they hadn't even alerted him when they were going. Quentin couldn't quite believe it. Penny must have taken down their ward from the outside, on the fly, from a standing start, in no more time than it took him to ride up 10 floors in an elevator. Quentin kept his face blank. He didn't want to give Penny the satisfaction of seeing how impressed he was.
Neutral. What about the key?
Penny dug it out of his jacket pocket and tossed it to Quentin.
Took it off your doorman. Kind of thing you learn on the street.
Quentin was going to say something about how the street in question was probably not a street at all, but a way or a lane located in some gated community. And anyway, it wasn't that hard to steal a key from a sleeping doorman when you were rocking Cholmondeley's stealth, but it just seemed so unimportant, and the words were just too heavy to get out of his mouth. Like they were stone blocks in his stomach that he would have had to physically cough up and regurgitate. Fuck Penny. He was wasting time. He had to talk to Alice.
But by then people had heard Penny's voice. Richard came shambling in from the kitchen where he'd been cleaning up, already awake and irritatingly showered and coiffed and groomed and pressed. Soon Janet came out of Elliot's room, regally swathed in a comforter as if nothing whatsoever unusual had happened the night before. She squeaked when she saw Penny and disappeared into a bathroom. Quentin realized he would have to get dressed and deal with this. Daylight was here, and with it had come the world of appearances and lies and acting like everything was fine. They were all going to make scrambled eggs and talk about how hungover they were and drink mimosas and Bloody Marys with extra Tabasco and black pepper and act like nothing was wrong, as if Quentin hadn't just broken Alice's heart for no better reason than that he was drunk and felt like it. And as unbelievable as unthinkable as it seemed, they were going to listen to what Penny had to say. He was a year behind Quentin and Alice, but by the end of his 4th year, Penny had decided. He explained once his audience was assembled and dressed and arranged around him in the living room with drinks and plates, standing or lying full length on couches or sitting cross-legged on the floor as their physical and emotional conditions permitted, that Brakebills had taught him everything it was going to teach him. So he dropped out and moved to a small town in Maine, a few miles north of Bar Harbor. The town was called Oslo, a seedy little resort village, with a population that shrank by 80% in the off-season. Penny chose Oslo, not even New Oslo, just Oslo as if they thought they came up with it first, for its total lack of anything that might distract him. He arrived in mid-September and had no trouble renting a small farmhouse on the outskirts of town on a 1-lane rural route. His landlord was a retired schoolteacher who handed him the keys and then fled to his winter home in South Carolina. Penny's nearest neighbors on either side were a congregationless one-shack Pentecostal church and an out-of-session summer camp for disturbed children. It was perfect. He had found his Walden. He had everything he needed: silence, solitude, a U-Haul trailer packed with an enviable library of magical codices, monographs, chapbooks, reference books, and broadsheets. He had a sturdy desk, a well-lit room, and a window with an unscenic view of an unmown backyard that offered no particular temptation to gaze out at it. He had a manageable, intriguingly dangerous research project that showed every sign of maturing into a genuinely interesting line of inquiry. He was in heaven. But one afternoon a few weeks after he arrived, as he sat at his desk, his watery blue eyes trailing over words of consummate power written centuries ago, with a pen made out of a hippogriff feather, Penny found his mind wandering. His large, usually lineless brow crinkled. Something was sapping his powers of concentration. Was he under attack? Maybe by a rival researcher? Who would dare? He rubbed his eyes and shook his head and focused harder. But his attention continued to drift. It turned out that Penny had discovered in himself a weakness, a flaw he never would have suspected himself of in 1,000 years, an age to which, with a few careful modifications that he would look into when he had the time, he had every intention of living. The flaw was this: he was lonely. The idea was outrageous, it was humiliating. Penny was a stone-cold loner, a desperado. He was the Han Solo of Oslo. He knew and loved this about himself. He had spent 4 interminable years at Brakebills surrounded by idiots except for Melanie, as he privately referred to Professor van der Wegge, and now he was finally free of their incessant bullshit. But now Penny found himself doing things for no reason. Unproductive things. He stood on a concrete dam near his farmhouse and threw down rocks to break up the thin crust of ice that formed on the outflow pond. He walked the 1.5 miles to the center of town and played video games in the windowless video arcade back behind the pharmacy, stuffing his mouth with stale gumballs from the gumball machine, alongside the no-hope, dead-eyed teenagers who hung out there and did the exact same thing. He made awkward, inexperienced eyes at the underage clerk at the book bin, which actually sold mostly stationery and greeting cards, not books. He confided his troubles to the miserable pod of 4 buffalo who lived on the buffalo farm out on the Bar Harbor Road. He thought about climbing over the fence and petting one of their huge, wedge-shaped heads, but he didn't quite have the nerve. They were big buffalo, and you never knew what they were thinking. That was September. By October, he had bought an herb green Subaru Impreza and was making regular trips to a dance club in Bangor, swigging from a 5th of vodka on the passenger seat since the club was all ages and didn't serve alcohol, as he drove the 45 minutes through trackless pine forests. Progress on his research project had dwindled to almost nothing. A couple of hours a day of listless leafing through old notes, punctuated by generous breaks for online porn. It was humiliating. The dance club in Bangor was open only on Friday and Saturday nights, and all he did there was shoot pool in a half-lit lounge area off the main dance floor with other creepy male loners like himself. But it was in that half-lit lounge on one of those Saturday nights that he spotted, to his secret consternation and even more secret relief and gratitude, a familiar face. It was a hard face to like the face of an emaciated corpse that hadn't been particularly attractive even in life, with a horrible pencil mustache on its upper lip. It belonged to the itinerant salesman Lovelady. Lovely was in the dance club in Bangor for approximately the same reason that Penny was there. He had run as far away as he could from the world of Brakebills and magic, and then gotten lonely. Over a pitcher of Coors Light and a few games of pool, all of which Lovelady won handily, you don't spend a lifetime trafficking in fake magical items without picking up a few real skills. They exchanged stories. Lovelady depended heavily for his livelihood on luck and the gullibility of strangers. He spent most of his time trolling the world's junk shops and estate sales the way longline fishermen troll the ocean. He accosted the emotionally vulnerable widows of recently deceased magicians and loitered on the outskirts of the conversations of his wisers and betters, keeping his eye out for anything that had value or that might plausibly be made to appear to have value. He had spent the past few months in northern England, in a studio apartment over a garage in a dreary suburb of Hull, trying his luck in antique stores and second-hand bookshops. His days were spent on buses, and when he was really down on his luck, on an ancient one-speed bicycle he borrowed without permission from the garage, which he wasn't supposed to have access to. At some point during his stay, Lovelady began to receive unwanted attention. Normally he was desperate for anybody to pay attention to him, anybody at all, but this was very different. Strangers on buses stared fixedly at him for no reason. Payphones rang when he walked by them. When he counted his change, he found only coins from the year he was born. When he watched TV, all he saw was an image of his own face, with a mysterious empty city in the background. Lovelady was neither learned nor particularly intelligent, but he survived on his instincts, and all his instincts told him that something was gravely amiss. Alone in his apartment, sitting on his pea soup-colored foam couch, Lovelady took stock. His best guess was this: he had inadvertently acquired an object of genuine power, and something out there coveted it. He was being hunted. That same night, he pulled up stakes. He abandoned a security deposit, donned a rattling array of charms and fetishes, took a bus to London and the Channel train to Paris, and from there crossed the Atlantic to throw himself on the already overtaxed mercy of Brakebills. He spent an exhausting afternoon combing the woods north of New York for the school's familiar, comforting compound. As the sun set through the trees and the early winter chill gnawed at the tips of his ears, the horrifying truth sank in. He was in the right place, but Brakebills would no longer appear to him. Something, either him or his wares, was objectionable to the school's defensive spells. Whatever he was carrying had rendered him untouchable. That was when he cut and ran to Maine. It was ironic. For once in his life, Lovelady had lucked into something genuinely powerful, a big score. But it was too much luck all at once. He was out of his league. He could have dumped his stock, all of it, right there in the middle of the frozen woods, but after a lifetime of greedy scrimping, he didn't quite have the gumption. It would have broken his avaricious heart. Instead, he rented a cozy cabin in the woods at the off-season rate and conducted a thorough inventory. He recognized it right away, mixed in with the jumbled consignment of grubby costume jewelry, in a plastic bag tied with a twisty. He didn't know what it was, but its power was obvious even to his untrained eye. He motioned Penny over to a corner, reached into the pocket of his seedy overcoat, which he hadn't taken off all night, and laid the baggie on a round particle board bar table. He grinned his livid, discolored grin at Penny. The buttons were ordinary surplus vintage buttons. 2 holes, 4 holes, fake leather, fake tortoiseshell, big angular novelty knobs, and tiny Bakelite pinpricks. A few of them were just leftover beads. Penny's eye immediately went to one of them, a flat, otherwise unremarkable pearlescent white overcoat button about an inch across. It was heavier than it should have been. It practically vibrated with barely contained magical force. Neutral, he knew what it was. He knew better than to touch it.
A magic button? How weird. What was it?
Her hair was a disaster, but she was obscenely relaxed, sipping coffee in an armchair, showing off her legs in a short silk bathrobe. She obviously felt triumphant, relishing her conquest and by extension her victory over Alice. Quentin hated her at that moment.
You really don't know.
Thoughtful Quentin thought he had a guess, but he wasn't going to say it out loud.
I made him come back with me to my house that night. He wasn't safe where he was, and at least I had a basic security setup. We called the woman who sold him the consignment, but she insisted the buttons weren't in her records. The next day we went and got his stuff and drove to Boston, and I gave him $80,000 for it. He wouldn't take cash, just gold and diamonds. I practically cleaned out a Harry Winston, but it was worth it. Then I told him to fuck off, and he did.
$80,000 wouldn't clear out a display case at a Zales, let alone a Harry Winston.
Penny ignored him. That was 2 days ago. That button attracts attention. I was staying at a hotel in Boston, but last night a fire 2 floors above me killed the cleaning lady. I never went back to my room. I took the Fanghua bus from South Station. I had to walk here from Chinatown. Whenever I got in a cab, the engine would die. But what matters is that it's real, and it's ours.
You are a fucking nutjob.
Kenton gets it. Anybody else?
Neutral cute, what is he talking about?
A silent spear of pure, glittering ice entered Quentin's heart. He hadn't heard Alice come in. She stood at the edge of the circle, her hair unwashed and adrift, like a sleepy child who wakes in the middle of the night and appears like an uncertain spirit at the edge of a grown-up party.
He doesn't know what he's talking about.
He couldn't look at her. He was drowning in remorse. It almost made him angry at her. How much it hurt to look at her.
Do you want to explain it? Or should I?
You do it. I'm not going to be able to say it without laughing my head off.
Well, somebody say something, or I'm going back to bed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are all going to Fillory.
At the end of the Wandering Dune, Penny began. It was a lecture he had obviously rehearsed Helen and Jane Chatwin receive a gift from Highbound, the captain of the rabbit-crewed clipper ship that the girls encounter in the desert. The gift is a little brass-bound oak chest containing 5 magical buttons, all different shapes and colors, one for each of the Chatwins, each with the power to take the wearer from Earth to Fillory and back again at will. Everybody in the room had read the Fillory books in Quentin's case multiple times, but Penny rehearsed the rules anyway. The buttons don't take you directly there. First, they move you to a kind of in-between netherworld, an interdimensional layover, and from there, you can make the leap to Fillory. No one knows where this transitional world is. It may be an alternate plane of existence, or a place between planes, interleaved between them like a flower pressed between pages, or a master plane that contains all planes, the spine that gathers the pages and binds them together. To the naked eye, it looks like a deserted city, an endless series of empty stone squares, but it serves as a kind of multi-dimensional switchboard. In the center of each square is a fountain. Step into one of them, the story goes, and you'll be transported to another universe. There are hundreds of different squares, possibly an infinite number, and a corresponding number of alternate universes. The bunnies call this place the Neitherlands, because it's neither here nor there, or sometimes just the city. But the most important point, Penny said, is that at the end of the Wandering Dune, Helen hid all the buttons somewhere in her aunt's house in Cornwall. She felt they were too mechanical. They made the journey too easy. Their power was wrong. You shouldn't be able to just go to Fillory whenever you wanted, like catching a bus, she argued. A trip to Fillory had to be earned. That had always been the way. It was a reward for the worthy bestowed by the ram gods Ember and Umber. The buttons were a perversion of this divine grace, a usurping of it. They broke the rules. Ember and Umber couldn't control them. Fillory was fundamentally a religious fantasy, but the buttons weren't religious at all. They were magical. They were just tools, with no values attached. You could use them for anything you wanted, good or evil. They were so magical, they were practically technological. So she hid them. Jane was inconsolable, understandably enough, and tore up half the property looking for them, but according to the Wandering Dune, she never found them, and Plover never wrote any more books. The Wandering Dune ends in the summer of 1917 or possibly 1918 because of the lack of real-world detail. It's impossible to date it precisely. After that, the whereabouts of the buttons is unknown. But try a thought experiment, Penny suggested. How long could a box of buttons hidden by a 12-year-old girl plausibly have stayed hidden? 10 years? 50? Nothing stays hidden forever. Wasn't it possible, even inevitable, that in the decades that followed a maid or a real estate agent or another little girl would have found them again? And that from there they would have made their way onto the magical gray market?
I always thought they were supposed to be lapel buttons, like a pin, like I like Ike.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. The Fillory books are fiction? Nothing you're talking about actually happened?
Neutral, yes and no. I'll allow that much of Plover's narrative might be fictional, or fictionalized, but I've come to believe that the basic mechanics of interdimensional travel that Plover describes are quite...
Really? And what makes you think that?
Quentin knew Penny well enough to know that he never bluffed, but he kept going anyway out of pig-headedness, urged on by his own inner vileness. Penny regarded him with benevolent pity as he prepared the hammer blow.
Well, I can certainly tell you that the Netherlands are very real. I've spent most of the past 3 years there.
No one had an answer to this. The room was silent. Quentin finally dared to glance over at Alice, but her face was a mask. It would almost have been better if she looked angry.
Understood, Thoughtful. I don't know if you know this. In fact, I'm pretty sure you don't, but I did most of my work at Brakebills on travel between alternate worlds. Melanie and I, as far as we could determine, it was an entirely new discipline. Not that I was the first person ever to study the subject, but I was the first to have a special aptitude for it. My talents were so unusual that Melanie, Professor van der Wiege, decided to pull me out of regular classes and give me my own course of study. The spellcraft was extremely involved, and I had to improvise a lot of it. I can tell you, a lot of what's in the canon on this stuff is way off base. Way off base. They're not seeing the whole picture, and the part of it they are seeing is by far the least important part. You'd think your friend Bigby would have some grasp of this stuff, but he has no idea. I was surprised. I really was. But there were still some issues I couldn't resolve.
Neutral, such as?
Well, so far, I've only been able to travel alone. I can transport my body and clothes and some small supplies, but nothing else and nobody else. Second, I can cross to the Netherlands, but that's it. I'm stuck there. The wider multiverse is closed to me.
You mean? Wait, so you've been to this amazing magical interval, but that's it? I thought you were coming in here this badass multi-dimensional desperado and all.
No. My explorations have been limited to the city. It's quite a rich environment in itself, an amazingly complex artifact to a magically trained eye. There's so little information in the books, the Wandering Dune is told through the eyes of a child, and it's not clear to me that either Plover or the Chatwins had any particular command of the techniques they describe. I thought at first that the entire place was a clutch, a virtual environment that functioned as a kind of three-dimensional interface hacked onto a master interdimensional switchboard. Not that it's much of an interface. A maze of identical, unlabeled squares. How much help is that? But it was all I could think of. Understood, the thing is, the more I study it, the more I think it's exactly the opposite. That our world has much less substance than the city. And what we experience as reality is really just a footnote to what goes on there. An epiphenomena. But now that we have the button, we'll learn so much more. We'll go so much further.
Neutral, have you tried it?
Penny hesitated. For somebody who so obviously wanted to be hardcore, he was painfully transparent.
Of course he hasn't. He's scared shitless. He has no idea what that thing is, only that it's dangerous as hell, and he wants one of us to be a guinea pig.
That's absolutely not true. An artifact on this level is best faced in the company of allies and observers, with the proper controls and safeguards. No reasonable magician.
Look, Penny, slow down. You've gotten so far ahead of yourself you can't even see how you got there. You've seen an old city and a bunch of pools and fountains, and you've got a button with some heavy-duty enchantments on it, and you're looking for some framework to fit them all together, and you've latched on to this fillery thing. But you're grasping at straws. It's crazy. You're cramming a few chance data points into a story that has nothing to do with reality. You need to take a giant step back. Take a deep breath. You're way off the reservation.
Nobody spoke. The skepticism in the room was palpable. Quentin was winning, and he knew it. Penny looked around at his audience beseechingly, unable to believe that he was losing them. Alice stepped forward into the empty circle around Penny.
Quentin, you have always been the most unbelievable pussy.
Her voice broke only a little as she said it. She grabbed Quentin's wrist with one hand and shoved the other one into the left-hand pocket of Penny's baggy black jeans. She fumbled for an instant. Then they vanished together. Neutral, THENEITHERLANDS. Quentin was swimming. Or he could have been swimming, but in fact he was just floating. It was dark, and his body was weightless, suspended in chilly water. His testicles shrank in on themselves away from the cold. Wavering, heatless sunbeams lanced down through the darkness.
After the first shock, the coolness of the water, combined with the weightlessness, felt indescribably good to his dried-out, feverish, unshowered, hungover body. He could have thrashed and panicked, but instead he just let himself hang there, arms out in a dead man's float. Whatever was coming next would come. He opened his eyes, and the water bathed them in moist, healing chill. He closed them again. There was nothing to see. It was a glorious relief. The numbness of it was just magnificent. At the moment when it had been at its most intolerably painful, the world, normally so unreliable and insensitive in these matters, had done him the favor of vanishing completely. Granted, he would need air at some point. He would look into that in due course. As bad as things were, drowning would still be a hasty course of action. For now, all he wanted was to stay here forever, hanging neutrally buoyant in the amniotic void, neither in the world nor out of it, neither dead nor alive.
But an iron manacle was clamped around his wrist. It was Alice's hand, and it was pulling him upward ruthlessly. She wouldn't let him be. Reluctantly, he joined her in kicking toward the surface. Their heads broke water at the same moment. They were in the center of a still, hushed, empty city square, treading water in the round pool of a fountain. It was absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects. Broad paving stones stretched away in all directions, clean and bare as if they'd just been swept. On all four sides of the square stood a row of stone buildings. They gave off an impression of indescribable age. They weren't decrepit, but they'd been lived in. They looked vaguely Italianate. They could have been in Rome or Venice, but they weren't. The sky was low and overcast, and a light rain was falling, almost mist. The droplets dimpled the still surface of the water, which made its way into the pool from the overflowing bowl of a giant bronze lotus flower. The square had the air of a place that had been hastily abandoned 5 minutes ago, or 5 centuries. It was impossible to tell. Quentin treaded water for a minute, then took one long breaststroke over to the stone lip. The pool was only about 15 feet across, and the rim was scarred and pocked. Old limestone. Bracing himself with both hands, he heaved himself up and blopped out of the water onto dry land.
Jesus. Fucking Penny. It is real. It wasn't just because he hated Penny. He really hadn't thought it was true. But now here they were in the city. This was it, the actual Netherlands, or something that looked uncannily like them. It was unbelievable. The most naive, most blissfully happy-sappy dream of his childhood was true. God, he'd been so wrong about everything. He took a deep breath, then another. It was like white light flooding through him. He didn't know he could be this happy. Everything that was weighing him down, Janet, Alice, penny, everything was suddenly insubstantial by comparison. If the city was real, then Fillory could be real too. Last night had been a disaster, an apocalypse, but this was so much more important. It was almost funny now. There was so much joy ahead of them. This is exactly...
Her fist caught him smack in his left eye. She hit like a girl, without any weight behind it, but he hadn't seen it coming to roll with it. The left half of the world flashed white. He bent over, half blind, the heel of his hand over his eye. She kicked him in the shins one and then the other with dismaying accuracy.
Asshole! You asshole!
Alice's face was pale. Her teeth were chattering.
You bastard. You fucking coward.
Alice, I'm sorry. But listen. Look.
He tried to point at the world around them while also verifying that his cornea was still intact.
Don't you fucking speak to me. Don't you even dare talk to me, you whore. You fucking whore.
She slapped wildly at his head and shoulders with both hands so that he ducked and put up his arms. He staggered a few steps away across the stone, trying to escape, his sopping wet clothes flapping, but she followed him like a swarm of bees. Their voices sounded small and empty in the echoless square.
Alice, forget about all that for a second. Just for a second. You don't understand. It was just everything. I got confused. Life just seemed so empty. I mean, out there it's like what you said. We have to live while we can. Or that's what I thought. But it got out of control. It just got out of control. We were all just so drunk.
Really? Too drunk to fuck? I could kill you. Do you understand that? I could burn you to nothing right where you stand. I'm stronger than you. Nothing you could do would stop me.
Listen, Alice. I know it's bad. It's very, very bad. And I'm so sorry. You'll never know how sorry. You have to believe me. But it's so important that you understand.
What are you, a child? You got confused? Why didn't you just end it, Quentin? You obviously lost interest a long time ago. You really are a child, aren't you? You're obviously not enough of a man to have a real relationship. You're not even enough of a man to end a real relationship. Do I have to do absolutely everything for you? Or you know what it is? You hate yourself so much, you'll hurt anybody who loves you. That's it, isn't it? Just to get even with them for loving you. I never saw that before now.
She stopped at this, shaking her head, lost in a dream of disbelief. Her own words had brought her up short. In the silence, the fact that he had cheated on her, and with Janet of all people, hit her all over again, as fully as it had the first time 2 hours ago. Quentin could see it. It was like she'd been shot in the stomach. She held up her hand, palm out, like she was shielding her eyes from his monstrous face. A lock of wet hair was plastered to her cheek. She was gasping for breath. Her lips had gone pale, but they kept moving.
Was it worth it? You always wanted her. You think I didn't see that? You think I'm stupid? Answer me, do you think I'm stupid? Just tell me. I really want to know if you think I'm stupid.
She ran at him and slapped his face. He took the full force of the blow.
No, I don't think you're stupid, Alice. But will you please look around you? Will you please acknowledge for a second that something more important than who stuck what body part where is going on around you?
He was begging, trailing after her, his voice ragged with exhaustion. She wasn't listening, or maybe she was just determined to say what she was going to say.
You know, I bet you actually thought fucking her was going to make you happy. You just go from one thing to the next, don't you? And you think it's going to make you happy. Brakebills didn't. I didn't. Did you really think Janet would? It's just another fantasy, Quentin.
She stopped and hugged her arms over her midsection like the pain was a gastric ulcer and sobbed bitterly. Her wet clothes clung to her. A little pool was forming around her. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't dare touch her. The stillness of the square was almost tangible around them. The Fillory books had described them as all exactly identical, but he could see they weren't, far from it. They shared the same crypto-Italian style, but this one had a colonnade on one side, and the fountain in the center was rectangular, not round like the one they'd come in through. At one end, a white marble face vomited water into it. Quentin thought he would have welcomed any interruption, anything, especially if it was carnivorous and would eat him alive.
Kind of a reunion, isn't it?
Neutral Penny came stepping briskly across the flagstones toward them. The gray facade of a stone piazza loomed above them with heraldic inlays, an anchor and 3 flames. Penny looked as happy and relaxed as Quentin had ever seen him. He was in his element and glowing with pride. His clothes were dry.
Sorry, I've spent so much time here, but I've never had anybody to show it to. You wouldn't think that would matter, but it does. When I first came through, there was a corpse lying right there on the ground, right over there. Human, or close to it anyway. Maybe Maori. He had a tattoo on his face. He could only have been dead a few days. Or must have gotten trapped here came in, but the pools wouldn't let him out somehow. I think he died of starvation. The next time I came, the body was gone.
Neutral Penny studied their two faces and took in the situation for the first time. Alice's tears, Quentin's rapidly darkening black eye, their toxic body language.
Oh, look, you have to forget about all that stuff here. This place can be dangerous if you're not paying attention. I'll give you an example. Which way would you go to get back to our home square?
Alice and Quentin looked around obediently, Penny's reluctant students. In their running fight, they had cut an angle through the second square into a third, or a fourth. Their footprints had already faded. There was an alley on each side of the square, and through each alley you could catch a glimpse of other irregular alleys and fountains and squares, more and more, diminishing to infinity. It was like a trick with mirrors. The sun was hidden, if there even was a sun. Penny was right. They had no idea which one led back to Earth, or even which general direction they'd come from.
Don't worry, I marked it. You only came about a quarter mile. One up and one over. In the book, they just wander at random, and it always comes out all right, but we have to be more careful. I use orange spray paint to mark a path. I have to do it fresh every time I come here. The paint disappears.
Penny headed back in the direction he'd pointed. Tentatively, without looking at each other, Quentin and Alice fell in behind him. Their clothes were getting damp all over again from the...
I have strict operating procedures when I'm here. There are no directions, so I've had to invent new ones. I named them after the buildings in the Earth Square, one for each side. Palace, villa, tower, church. Can't be a real church, but that's what it looks like. This is Churchward, the way we're going now.
They were back at the fountain, which Penny had circled with big sloppy X's of fluorescent orange paint. A little way off there was a crude shelter, a tarp with a cot and a table underneath. Quentin wondered how he'd missed it before.
I set up a base camp here for a while with food and water and books. I always thought it would be Melanie who came here the first time, but she could never quite work the spells. I tried to teach her, but she's not quite strong enough. Almost, though. In a way, I'm happy it's you guys. You know you were the only friends I ever had at Brakebills?
Amused, Penny shook his head as if there was something amazing about the fact that more people didn't like him. Only 12 hours ago, Quentin thought, he and Alice would have barely been able to keep from cracking up with conspiratorial laughter at the suggestion that they had ever been friends with Penny.
Oh, I almost forgot. No light spells here. They go crazy. When I first came here, I tried to do a basic illumination. I couldn't see for 2 hours afterward. It's like the air here is hyperoxygenated, only with magic. One spark and everything goes up.
There were 2 stone steps leading up to the fountain. Quentin sat down on the top one and leaned his back against the rim. The water looked unnaturally black like ink. There was no point in fighting anymore. He would just sit here and listen to Penny talk.
You wouldn't believe how far I've walked in this place. Hundreds of miles. Way farther than the Chatwins ever went. Once I saw a fountain that had overflowed like a plugged-up toilet and flooded its square a foot deep, and half the squares around it. Twice I've seen ones that were capped, sealed over with a bronze cover like a well, like they were keeping people out. Or in. Once I found fragments of white marble on the pavement. I think it was a broken sculpture. I tried to piece it back together, to see what it was a statue of, but I never could. You can't get into the buildings. I've tried every way you can think of. Lock picks. Sledgehammers. Once I brought an acetylene cutting torch, and the windows are too dark to see in. But once I brought a flashlight, you know, one of those high-intensity rescue flashlights that the Coast Guard uses. When I turned it all the way up, I could see inside, just a little bit. I'll tell you something. They're full of books. Whatever they look like on the outside, on the inside, every one of these buildings is really a library.
Quentin had no idea how long they'd been there, but it was a while. Hours, maybe. They'd walked through square after square like lost tourists. The 3 of them. Everything they saw shared a common style. and the same weathered ancient look, but nothing ever quite repeated. Quentin and Alice couldn't look at each other, but they couldn't resist the seductions of this grand melancholy place either. At least the rain had let up. They passed through a tiny square, a quarter the size of the others and paved in cobblestones, where if they stood in the center it seemed like they could hear the ocean, the breaking and withdrawing of waves. In another square, Penny pointed out a window with ghostly scorch marks above it as if it had been the scene of a fire. Quentin wondered who had built this place and where they'd gone. What had happened here? Penny described in great technical detail his elaborate but ultimately unsuccessful campaign to rappel up the side of one of the buildings to get a view above the rooftops. The one time he'd managed to secure a line on a piece of decorative masonry, he'd been overcome by dizziness halfway up, and when he recovered, he found himself turned around, rappelling down the same wall he'd been trying to ascend. At different times, all three of them saw, in the farthest possible distance, a verdant square that seemed to contain a garden with rows of what might have been lime trees in it. But they could never reach it. As they approached it, always lost itself in the shifting perspectives of the alleyways, which were slightly out of alignment with one another.
We should get back.
Why? It doesn't matter how much time we spend here, you know. No time passes on Earth. To the others, it'll be like we popped out and popped right back. Just like that, bing bang. They won't even have time to be surprised. I spent a whole semester here once and nobody noticed.
I'm sure we wouldn't have noticed anyway.
I'm actually probably a year or so older than you guys subjectively. Because of all the time I spent here, I should have kept closer track.
Neutral, Penny. What are we doing here?
Isn't it obvious? Quentin, we're going to Fillory. We have to. This is going to change everything.
Okay, Penny, we have to slow down. Look at the big picture. The Chatwins got to go to Fillory because they were chosen. By Ember and Umber, the magic sheep. Rams. They were there to do good, to fight the Watcher Woman, or whatever.
They only got to go when something was going on. The Watcher Woman, or the Wandering Dune, or that ticking watch thing in the flying forest. Or to find Martin. That was what Helen Chatwin was saying. We can't just go barging in without an invitation. That's why she hid the buttons in the first place. They were a mistake. Fillory wasn't like the real world. It was a perfect universe where everything was organized for good. Ember and Umber are supposed to control the borders. But with the buttons, anybody could get in. Random people who weren't part of the story, bad people. The buttons weren't part of the logic of Fillory. They were a hole in the border, a loophole.
The mere fact that Alice knew her Fillory lore cold, no hesitation, added another high-powered exponent to Quentin's guilty, bankrupt longing for her. How could he have gotten so confused that he thought he wanted Janet instead of her?
Penny was nodding and rocking his whole body forward and backwards semi-autistically.
But you're forgetting something, Alice. We're not bad people. We're the good guys. Has it occurred to you that maybe that's why we found the button in the first place? Maybe this is it. We're getting the call. Maybe Fillory needs us.
He waited expectantly for a reaction.
It's thin, Penny. This is all really thin.
So what? So what? So what if Fillory doesn't work out? Which it will. So we end up somewhere else. It's another world, Quentin. It's a million other worlds. The Netherlands are the place where all worlds meet. Who knows what other imaginary universes might turn out to be real? All of human literature could just be a user's guide to the multiverse. Once I marked off 100 squares straight in one direction and never saw the edge of this place. We could explore for the rest of our lives and never begin to map it all. This is it, Quentin. It's the new frontier, the challenge of our generation and the next 50 generations after that. It all starts here, Quentin. With us, you just have to want it. What do you say?
He actually stuck out his hand as if he expected Quentin and Alice to put theirs on top of his, and they would all do a football cheer. Go team! Quentin was sorely tempted to leave him hanging, but finally he let Penny give him a limp low five. His eye still throbbed.
We should get back.
She looked exhausted. She couldn't have slept much last night. Alice produced the oddly weighty pearl button from her pocket. It looked ridiculous. It had sounded reasonable enough in the books, but that was the books, and the Chatwins had used the buttons only the one time. In real life, it was like they were playing some children's game. It was a little kid's idea. The Magicians, cast by our Tale Studio. Please subscribe to our channel if you enjoy listening.
Thoughtful of a magical object. Though, what did you expect from a bunch of talking bunnies?
Back in their home square, they lined up on the edge of the fountain, holding hands, balancing precariously on the rim. The prospect of getting wet again was unspeakably depressing. In a corner of the square, Quentin saw that a sapling had broken its way up through one of the paving stones from below. It was gnarled and bent, twisted almost into the shape of a helix, but it was alive. It made him wonder what had been paved over to build the city and what would be there if it should ever fall. Had there been woods here? Would there be again? This too shall pass. Alice stood on Penny's other side so she wouldn't have to touch Quentin. They stepped off the edge together, right foot first, in sync. The crossing was different this time. They fell down through the water like it was air, then through darkness, then it was like they were falling out of the sky, down toward Manhattan on a gray Friday morning in winter-brown parks. Gray buildings, yellow taxis waiting on streepy white crosswalks, black rivers studded with tugboats and barges down through the gray roof and into the living room where Janet and Elliot and Richard were still caught in mid-double take, as if Alice had just now grabbed the button in Penny's pocket, as if the past 3 hours hadn't even happened.
Alice, get your hand out of Penny's pants.
Of course, after that, everybody had to go. They barely even said anything about Quentin's swollen eye.
Thoughtful, the natives were restless.
Moments after he and Alice returned, Josh came in. He'd spent the night with the Nice after all, and they had to tell him the whole story all over again. Then they went through in threes. Josh went through with Penny and Richard. Penny took Janet and Elliot through. Josh called Aeneas and made her come over, and she went through with him and Penny. Of them all, only Janet had a bad reaction. The moment they surfaced, apparently, she heaved and threw up her breakfast right into the cold, clear, magical water. Then she panicked. Elliot came back with a dead-on impression of the frantic way she'd clutched Penny's arm and said,
Button! Button now!
Quentin was unmoved by her discomfort. She was a vampire, he thought. She preyed on other people's healthy love and made it sick and crippled.
The mood in the room was serious and sober. Everybody gave each other long, searching looks heavy with significance. Nobody could seem to put into words how important it was, but they all agreed that this was a major thing. Major. And it had to be their thing. For now, at least, they had to contain it. Nobody else could know. At Penny's insistence, they sat down in a big circle on the rug in the living room and rewove the wards on the apartment, right then and there, working together. Richard's taste for authority, which so often made his presence all but unendurable, turned out to come in handy now. He directed the group, casting in an efficient, businesslike fashion, like a seasoned conductor leading a chamber orchestra through a difficult passage of Bartok. It took 20 minutes to finish the spell, and then 10 more to add some fancy extra defensive and concealment layers, prudent, given the level of interest the button was evidently attracting in the at-large magical ecosystem. When they were done, when everything was checked out and double-checked, a hush settled over the room. They all sat still and just let the magnitude of what was happening here marinate in their minds. Josh rose quietly and went to the kitchen to make sandwiches for lunch. Elliot threw open a window and lit a cigarette. Janet regarded Quentin with cool amusement.
Thoughtful Quentin lay back on the rug and stared up at the ceiling. He needed sleep, but this was no time for sleep. Wild emotions competed for possession of his brain, like rival armies taking and retaking the same hill. Excitement, remorse, anticipation, foreboding, grief, anger. He tried to focus on Fillory, to make the good feeling come back. This would change everything. Yes, his universe had just expanded times a million, but Fillory was the key to it all. That creeping, infectious sense of futility that had been incubating in his brain even since before graduation had met its magic bullet. Alice didn't see it yet, but she would. This was what they'd been waiting for. This is what her parents had never found. A bleary grin kept smearing itself across his face, and the years fell away from him like layers of dead skin. They weren't wasted years exactly. He could never say that, but they were years in which, in spite of all his amazing gifts, he'd been conscious of somehow not quite getting the gift he wanted. Enough to get by on, maybe? Sure. But this was everything. Now the present had a purpose, and the future had a purpose. And even the past, their whole lives, retroactively had meaning. Now they knew what it was for. Worried if only it hadn't happened now. If Penny could just have shown up a day earlier. Fucking Penny. Everything had been completely ruined, and then completely redeemed in such rapid succession that he couldn't tell which state ultimately applied. But if you looked at it a certain way, what happened between him and Janet wasn't about him and Janet at all, or even him and Alice. It was a symptom of the sick, empty world they were all in together. And now they had the medicine. The sick world was about to be healed.
The others stayed sitting on the floor, leaning back on their elbows, lounging with their backs against the couch, glancing at one another every once in a while, and breaking out in incredulous giggles. It was like they were stoned.
Thoughtful Quentin wondered if they were feeling what he was feeling. This was what they'd been waiting for too. Without knowing it, he thought. The thing that was going to save them from the ennui and depression and meaningless busy work that had been stalking them ever since graduation, with its stale, alcoholic breath. It was finally here, and not a moment too soon. They couldn't go on like this, and now they wouldn't have to.
It was Elliot who finally took control of the situation. He almost seemed like his old self again. Calendars were cleared. Nobody had any serious obligations pending. Not compared to this, nothing that couldn't be delayed or sicked out of or blatantly welched on. He clapped his hands and gave orders, and everybody seemed to enjoy being serious and efficient for a change. Nobody knew Anais especially well, not even Josh, really. But she turned out to be a highly useful individual. Her circle of acquaintance included somebody who knew somebody who owned a place upstate, a comfortable old farmhouse on 100 acres, somewhere private enough and defensible enough to use as a staging area for whatever it was they were going to do next. And that first somebody was also a magician senior enough to open a portal to get them there. She would come by later that afternoon, as soon as the Nets game was over. They had to do it on the roof, because the very effective and thorough triple wards they'd just that morning set up and were now about to abandon prevented any magical transport directly in or out of the apartment. By 5:30 that afternoon, they were looking out over the crowded cocktail tray skyline of Lower Manhattan. No one else was up there in winter. The roof was littered with windblown, overturned plastic lawn furniture and char-encrusted barbecue implements. A lonely wind chime burbled to itself from the eaves of a utility shed. They hugged themselves against the cold and scuffed the gravel with their feet as they watched a hale. Gray-haired Belgian sorceress with nicotine-stained fingers and a rather sinister wicker fetish on a string around her neck pull open the portal. It was a 5-sided portal, the bottom edge running parallel to the ground, and its vertices shed tiny sputtering actinic blue-white sparks, a purely cosmetic touch. Quentin suspected, but they gave the scene an air that was both melancholy and festive at the same time. There was a sense of momentous occasion. They were embarking on a grand adventure on the spur of the moment. Isn't that what it means to be alive, goddammit? When the portal was finished and stable, the gray-haired witch kissed Anais on both cheeks, said something in French, and left hurriedly, but not before Janet made her take a picture of all of them together with their trunks and bundles and bags full of groceries piled up behind them, using a disposable camera. The group, all 8 of them now, stepped through together onto a vast, frost-burnt front lawn. The serious mood on the roof was instantly broken as Janet and Anais and Josh raced one another inside and squealed and bounced on the sofas and ran around arguing over the bedrooms. Anais had been mostly right about the house. It was certainly large and comfortable, and at least a few bits of it were old. Apparently, it was once a generously proportioned colonial farmhouse, but somebody with progressive architectural ideas had gotten hold of it and remixed its old timber and fieldstone with glass and titanium and poured cement and aga range. Alice went directly and silently up to the master bedroom, which took up almost half the 3rd floor, and closed the door, glaring away any rival claimants with burning, red-rimmed eyes. Suddenly exhausted after his mostly sleepless night, followed by his magically extended day, Quentin found a small guest bedroom at the back of the house. Its hard antiseptic twin bed felt like all he deserved. It was dark when he woke up. The cool blue digits of the clock radio said 10:27. In the darkness, they could have been phosphorescent squiggles on the side of a deep-sea fish. He couldn't find a light switch, but his groping hands encountered the door to a small half-bath and managed to turn on the light over the mirror. Quentin splashed water on his face and wandered out into the strange house. He found the others except for Alice and Penny in the dining room, where they'd already made and demolished a meal of heroic proportions, the remains of which lay spread out on a stupendous table that looked like it was built from the beams of the true cross, handsomely varnished and nailed together with authentic iron spikes. Large pieces of modern art, the color and texture of dried, crusted blood, hung on the walls.
Q.
Worried? Where's Alice?
Came and went. What's going on? You guys fighting or what?
He shadowboxed a jab or two. He obviously didn't know what had happened. Anais, sitting next to him, delivered a mock knockout punch to his stubbly chin. They were all drunk again, same as last night, same as every night. Nothing had changed.
Seriously, did she give you that shiner? Seems like somebody's always punching you in the face, Q.
Her manner was as bright and toxic as ever, but her eyes were rimmed with red. Quentin wondered if she'd come out of last night's Holocaust quite as unscathed as he'd thought.
It was Ember and Umber, the magic rams. Didn't Alice tell you? They punished me for being sinful.
Yeah? Did you kick their woolly asses?
I turned the other cheek.
Quentin didn't feel like talking, but he was hungry. He got a plate from the kitchen and sat down at the far end of the table and served himself leftovers.
We were talking about what to do next. Making up an actions list.
Neutral. Right.
Who's got some action items for me? We need to enumerate our deliverables.
Food. And if we're really going to Fillory, we all need to reread all the books.
Thoughtful gold. And trade items. What do Filarians want? Cigarettes?
We're not going to Brezhnev or Russia. An ice? Steel?
A torch full gunpowder?
My God, listen to you people. I am not going to be the man who brought the gun to Fillory.
We should bring overcoats, tents, cold weather gear. We have no idea what season it is there. We could be walking into deep winter.
Yesterday, meaning before his nap Fillory was going to make everything all right. Now it was hard to focus on it. It seemed like a dream again. Now the mess with Janet and Alice was the real thing. It would drag everything else down with it.
He pulled himself together with an effort.
How long are we talking about going for?
A couple of days? Look, we can just come back if we forget something. With the button, it's a snap. We'll just stay till it gets boring.
What should we do when we get there?
I think they'll probably give us a quest. That's what always happened to the Chatwins.
Heads turned. Penny was standing in the doorway in a t-shirt and sweatpants, blinking like an owl, looking like he'd just woken up too.
I don't know if we can count on that, Penny. For some reason, it annoyed Quentin how starry-eyed and optimistic Penny was being about this. It's not like the ram summoned us. It might not even be like the books. Maybe there never were any quests. Plover probably just put that stuff in so there would be a good story. Maybe we'll just suck around Fillory like we're sucking around here.
Don't be a killjoy, just because your girlfriend beats you up.
Neutral Penny was shaking his head.
I just don't see Plover coming up with all that stuff on his own. It's not rational. He was a gay dry cleaning magnate with a background in practical chemistry. He didn't have a creative bone in his body. No way. It's Occam's razor. It's much more likely that he was writing it as it happened.
So what do you think? We're going to meet a damsel in distress.
We might. Not necessarily a damsel, but, you know, a nymph maybe. Or a dwarf, or a Pegasus. You know, that needs help with something.
Everybody was laughing, but Penny kept on going. It was almost touching.
Seriously, it happens in the books, every time.
Josh pushed a tiny doll glass of something clear and alcoholic in front of Quentin, and he took a sip. It was some kind of fiery fruit eau de vie, and it tasted like a vital nutrient that his body had been chronically deprived of his entire life.
Sure, but real life's not actually like that. You don't just go on fun adventures for good causes and have happy endings. You're not going to be a character in a story. There's nobody arranging everything for you. The real world just doesn't work like that.
Maybe your world doesn't earth, man. We're not in your world anymore.
And I don't want to turn this into a theological discussion, but there is room for disagreement on that score.
And even if you don't believe that this world has a god, you must admit that Fillory has one. Two, even.
This does bring us back, albeit in an insane way, to what is actually a pretty reasonable question, which is what do we do when we get there?
We should go after that magic flower. You know, the one that when you smell it, it automatically makes you happy? Remember that? That thing would be worth bank here.
While nobody was watching, Janet caught Quentin's eye and waggled her eyebrows and did something lewd with her tongue. Quentin eyed her back, unblinking.
She was actually enjoying this, he thought. She'd sabotaged him and Alice, and she was loving it. Little montage flashes of last night. It couldn't possibly have just been last night cycled through his brain. Snapshots that had stubbornly survived the merciful angel of alcoholic erasure. Everything about sex with Janet had been so different from Alice. The smell, the feel of her skin, her businesslike know-how. The shame and the fear had caught up with him even before it was over. Before he came, but he hadn't stopped. And had Elliot really been awake for the whole thing? His brain dealt out a sloppy fan of mental Polaroids, out of sequence. An image of Janet kissing Elliot, of her hand working diligently between Elliot's legs. Had she really been weeping? Had he kissed Elliot? A vivid sense memory of somebody else's stubble, surprisingly scratchy, chafing his cheek and upper lip. Good God, he thought wearily. What goes on? He had reached the outer limits of what fun, capital F, could do for him. The cost was way too high, the returns pitifully inadequate. His mind was dimly awakening too late to other things that were as important, or even more so. Poor Alice. He needed a hair shirt, or ashes, or a scourge. There should be some ritual that he could perform to show her how desperately sorry he was. He would do anything if she would just tell him what to do. He shoved the pictures back down wherever they came from, back into the mental shuffle, speeding them on their way with some more of that yummy eau de vie. An idea was germinating in his tired, bruised brain.
Thoughtful? We could find Martin Chatwin, the way the other children were always trying to.
Thoughtful, I'd like to bring something back for Fogg. Something for the school. An artifact or something.
That's it? You're going to Fillory to bring back an apple for teacher? God, you're so unbelievably lame sometimes.
Oddly, Elliot didn't take the bait. This was affecting them all in different ways.
Maybe we could find the questing beast.
The what?
No Fillory scholar, he.
Thoughtful, from the girl who told time. Remember? The beast that can't be caught. Helen chases it.
What do you do with it if you do catch it? Eat it?
I don't know. Maybe it leads you to treasure, or gives you some secret wisdom, or something.
He hadn't thought this through completely. It had seemed important to the Chatwins, but now he couldn't remember why.
Understood? Never find out. Not in the books. They never catch it, and Plover never mentions it again. It's a good idea, but I was thinking, maybe they'll make us kings. Kings and queens, the way the Chatwins were.
As soon as Penny said it, Quentin wondered why he hadn't thought of it himself. It was so obvious. They'd be kings and queens. Of course they would. If the city was real, why not all the rest of it? Even that. They could live in Castle White Spire. Alice could be his queen. God, he was agreeing with Penny. That was a danger sign if there ever was one.
Huh. Would we have to marry each other?
Not necessarily. The Chatwins didn't. Then again, they were all siblings.
I don't know. It sounds like a big job, being queen. There is probably bureaucracy. Administration.
Lucrative, though. Think of the perks.
If the books are even accurate, and if the thrones are vacant, that's 2 big ifs. Plus there's 7 of us and only 4 thrones. 3 people get left out.
I'll tell you what we need. We need war magic. Battle magic. Offense, defense. We need to be able to hurt people if we have to.
Janet looked amused.
Shit's illegal, babe. You know that.
I don't care if it is. We need it. We have no idea what we will be seeing when we cross over. We have to be ready. Unless any of you big strong men knows how to use a sword.
There was silence, and she smirked.
Alors?
Did they teach you that stuff where you went?
He looked a little afraid of her.
We are not so pure in Europe as you Americans, I guess.
P-neutral Penny was nodding.
Battle magic isn't illegal in Fillory.
Out of the question. Do you realize the kind of heat you'd bring down on us? Who here besides me has dealt with the magician's court? Anybody?
We're already in the shit, Richard. You think that button would be legal if the court knew about it? If you want out, get out now, but Aeneas is right. I'm not going over there with just my dick in my hand.
We can get a dispensation for small arms. There are precedents for that. I know the forms.
Guns? What is wrong with you? Fillory is a pristine society. Have you ever even watched Star Trek? This is basic Prime Directive stuff. We have a chance to experience a world that has not yet been fucked up by assholes. Do any of you get how important that is? Any of you?
Quentin kept expecting Elliot to declare himself too cool for the whole Fillory project and start making snarky jokes about it, but he was turning out to be surprisingly focused and unironic about it. Quentin couldn't remember the last time Elliot had been openly enthusiastic about anything. It was a relief to see that he could still admit that he cared about something.
I do not want to be around Penny with a gun.
Look, Anase is right. We'll work up some basic attack spells, just in case. Nothing too insane. We'll just have a couple aces in the hole. And we have those cacodemons in our backs, don't forget. And the button.
Andar te ramer le fiscals.
The next day, Richard, Elliot, Janet, and Anais drove into Buffalo to shop for supplies. Janet, being from LA, was the only one who had a driver's license. Quentin, Josh, Alice, and Penny were supposed to be researching battle magic, but Alice wouldn't speak to Quentin. He had knocked on her door that morning, but she wouldn't come out, and the technicalities were beyond Josh, so it came down to Alice and Penny working together. Soon the big dining room table was covered with books from Penny's U-Haul stash and sheets of butcher paper crawling with flowcharts. They were deep into it. As the two biggest magic nerds of the group, Alice and Penny were completely absorbed in each other. Speaking some ad hoc technical jargon they came up with on the fly, Penny scribbling reams of archaic notations and Alice nodding seriously over his shoulder and pointing. They were doing original work, building spells from scratch. It wasn't fantastically difficult stuff, but any prior art in the area had been thoroughly suppressed.
Watching them work, Quentin was consumed with jealousy. Thank God it was Penny anybody else, and he would have been seriously suspicious. He and Josh spent the afternoon in the den with some beer and smart food watching cable on a flat-screen TV the size of a billboard. There had been no TV at Brakebills or in their Manhattan apartment, and it felt exotic and forbidden.
Around 5 o'clock, Elliot came and roused them.
Come on, you're missing Penny's big show.
How was Buffalo?
Like a vision of the apocalypse. We bought parkas and hunting knives.
They trailed Elliot out to the backyard. Seeing him happy and excited and reasonably sober restored Quentin's faith in the possibility that they were on the right track, that everything broken was fixable. He grabbed a scarf and a bizarre Russian hat with ear flaps that he found in a closet. The sun was setting behind the Adirondacks in the distance, cold and red and desolate through the haze. The others were grouped at the bottom of the lawn, which sloped down to a row of bare, decorative lindens. Penny was sighting down his arm at one of the trees while Alice paced off distance in long, even steps. She jogged over to Penny and they whispered. Then she paced off the distance again. Janet stood to one side with Richard, looking adorable in a pink parka and a woolly watch cap.
All right, stand back, everybody.
How much farther back can we stand?
Sitting on a broken white marble balustrade, a random architectural element dropped in by the landscaper. He took a nip from a bottle of schnapps and passed it to Elliot.
Just so you're standing back. Okay, fire in the hole.
Like a sequined assistant, Alice stepped up to an end table on the green, placed an empty wine bottle on it, and stepped away. Facing the bottle, Penny took a quick breath and spoke a rapid sequence of clipped syllables under his breath, ending with a one-handed flicking gesture. Something a spray of three-something steely gray and tightly grouped shot out of his fingertips, too fast to follow, and flickered across the lawn. Two of them missed, but one of them snapped the bottle's neck off cleanly, leaving the base standing headlessly upright. Penny grinned. There was scattered applause.
We call it Magic Missile.
Magic missile, baby. That's straight up Dungeons and Dragons shit.
Penny nodded.
We actually based some of this on old D&D spells. There's a lot of practical thinking in those books.
Wasn't anybody going to say anything? This was dark magic. God knows he wasn't a prude. But this was a spell meant to break up flesh. To physically wound, they were crossing so many lines it was hard to figure out where they were anymore. If they ever actually had to cast this stuff, it would already be too late. Worried God, I hope we don't have to use that.
Oh, come on, Contina. We're not looking for trouble. We just want to be ready if it comes. Dungeons and Dragons, motherfucker!
Next, Alice whisked the card table away so that Penny stood alone, facing the dark line of lindens. The others stood and sat scattered behind him, under the empty sunset sky. The sun was almost down now. Their noses were running and their ears were red, but the cold didn't seem to bother Penny, who was still wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants. They were really in the middle of nowhere. Quentin was used to the background blare and hum of Manhattan, And even at Brakebills, there were so many people around. There had always been someone somewhere yelling or knocking something over or blowing something up. Here, when the wind wasn't sighing moodily in the trees, there was nothing. The whole world was on mute. Neutral, he tied down the ear flaps of his Russian hat with a string.
If this doesn't work,
Just do it already. It's cold out here.
Penny did a deep knee bend and spat on the gray-brown grass. Then he executed a grotesque, wild-armed flailing movement, at odds with what Quentin had seen of his otherwise highly disciplined style. Violet light sputtered in his cupped hands in the darkness so that the bones in his fingers were visible through the skin. He shouted something and finished with an overarm pitching motion. A small, dense orange spark left Penny's palm and flew across the grass, dead level. At first it looked absurdly inoffensive, silly, like a toy or an insect. But as it sailed toward the trees it grew, blooming into a fiery, sparking comet the size of a beach ball, veined and roiling and snapping. It was almost stately, spinning slowly backward as it moved through the cold dusk air. Shadows wound across the lawn, shifting with the fast-moving light source. The heat was intense. Quentin felt it on his face. When it hit a linden, the whole tree went up at once with a single loud crackling woof. A gout of flame ascended into the sky and vanished.
fireball.
It was an instant bonfire. The tree burned fast and merrily. Sparks flew up impossibly high into the twilight sky. Janet whooped and jumped up and down and clapped her hands like a cheerleader. Penny smiled thinly and took a theatrical bow.
They stayed at the house upstate for a few more days, lounging around, grilling on the back patio, drinking up all the good wine, going through the DVD collection, all cramming into the hot tub and then not cleaning it afterward. The fact was, Quentin realized, after all the build-up, all the hasty preparation and rush, they were stalling, vamping, waiting for something to push them into pulling the trigger. They were so excited they didn't see how terrified they were. And when he thought about all the happiness waiting for him in Fillory, Quentin almost felt like he didn't deserve it. He wasn't ready. Ember and Umber would never have summoned someone like him. In the meantime, Alice had somehow figured out a way of never being in the same room as Quentin at the same time. She'd developed a sixth sense about him. He'd catch a glimpse of her out a window, or a flash of her feet as she vanished upstairs. But that was as close as they came. It was almost like a game. The others played it too. When he did spot her in the open sitting up on the kitchen counter, kicking her legs and chatting with Josh, or hunched over the dining room table with Penny and his books, like everything was fine, he didn't dare intrude. That would be against the rules of the game. Seeing her there, so close and at the same time so infinitely removed, was like looking through a doorway into another universe, a warm, sunny, tropical dimension that he had once inhabited, but from which he was now banished. Every night he left flowers outside her bedroom door. Thoughtful it was a shame. He probably never even had to know what happened. He could easily have missed it. Though maybe they would have stayed there forever if he had. He stayed up late one night, playing cards with Josh and Elliot. Playing cards with magicians always degenerated into a meta contest over who was better at warping the odds, so that practically every hand came up 4 aces against a couple of straight flushes. Quentin was tentatively feeling better. They were drinking grappa. The twisted knot of shame and regret in his chest that had been there since the night with Janet was gradually coming undone, or at least scarring over. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't everything either. There was so much right between him and Alice. They could get past this. Maybe it was time he helped her see that. He knew she wanted to. He'd screwed up. He was sorry they would get past it. QED. They just needed to get it into perspective. She was probably just waiting for him to say it. He excused himself and headed up the stairs to the 3rd floor where the master bedroom was.
Josh and Elliot gamely rooted him on his way.
Q, 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 Q.
When he was almost at the top of the stairs, he stopped. Quinn would have known it anywhere, the sound that Alice made when she was having sex.
Now here was a conundrum for his drunken mind to reflect on. She was making it now, but it wasn't Quentin who was making her make it. He stared down at the burnt orange natural weave fibers of the runner that ran down the middle of the stairs. He could not be hearing that sound. It came in through his ears and made spots appear in his vision. His blood fizzed like a science experiment and turned to acid. The acid propagated through his body and made his arms and legs and brain burn. Then it made its way to his heart, like a deadly blood clot that had broken loose and was drifting free, bringing death with it. When it reached his heart turned white, Hot. Furious she was with Penny or Richard, obviously. He had just left Josh and Elliot, and they would never do that to him anyway. He walked stiff-legged, back down the stairs, and down the hall to Richard's room, and kicked open the door and slapped the light on. Richard was there in bed, alone. He sat bolt upright, blinking in an asinine Victorian nightshirt. Quentin turned off the light and slammed the door shut again.
What's going on?
He shouldered roughly past her.
Hey, that hurt?
Furious hurt. What did she know about hurt? He snapped on the lamp in Penny's room. Penny's bed was empty. He picked up the lamp and threw it on the floor. It flashed and died. Quentin had never felt like this before. It was kind of amazing. His anger was making him superpowered. He could do anything. There was literally nothing he could not do. Or almost. He tried to rip down Penny's curtains, but they wouldn't come even when he hung on them with all his weight. Instead, he opened the window and ripped the clothes off the bed and stuffed them out through it. Not bad, but not enough. He spiked the alarm clock, then started pulling books off the shelves. Penny had a lot of books. It was going to take a while to get them all off the shelves. But that was okay. He had all night, and he had all the energy in the world. Wasn't even sleepy. It was like he was on speed.
Except that after a while it got harder to pull the books off the shelves because Josh and Richard were holding his arms. Quentin thrashed insanely, like a toddler having a tantrum. They dragged him out into the hall.
It was so stupid, really. So obvious. Certainly you couldn't call it clever. He fucked Janet. She fucks Penny. They should be even now. But he'd been drunk. How did that make them even? He barely knew what he was doing. How did that make them even? And Penny, Jesus. He wished it had been Josh.
They confined him to the den, gave him the bottle of grappa and a stack of DVDs, and figured he'd knock himself out. Josh stayed there to make sure Quentin didn't try any magic. As worked up as he was, but he nodded off right away, his round cheek on the hard arm of the couch, like a sleepy apostle.
As for Quentin, sleep didn't interest him right now. The pain was a falling feeling. It was a little like coming off the ecstasy, that long descent. He was like a cartoon character who falls off a building. Pow, he hits an awning. But he punches straight through it. Pow, he hits another one. And another one. Surely one of them will catch him and sprowing him back up, or just fold up and embrace him like a canvas cradle, but it doesn't. It's just one flimsy busted awning after another. Down and down and down. After a while he longs to stop, even if it means hitting the sidewalk. But he doesn't. He just keeps falling down through awning after awning, deeper and deeper into the pain, turtles, all the way down. Quentin didn't bother with the DVDs, just flipped channels on the huge TV, and slugged straight from the bottle until sunlight came bleeding up over the horizon, like more acid blood oozing out of his sick ruptured heart, which felt, not that anybody cared, like a rotten drum of biohazardous waste at the very bottom of a landfill, leaching poison into the groundwater. Enough poison to kill an entire suburb full of innocent and unsuspecting children. He never did fall asleep. The idea came over him around dawn, and he waited as long as he could, but it was just too damn good to keep to himself. He was like a kid on Christmas morning who couldn't wait for the grown-ups to waken. Santa was here, and he was going to fix everything. At 7:30, still half drunk, he busted out of the den and went down the hallways banging on doors. What the hell, he even climbed the stairs and kicked open Alice's door, caught a glimpse of Penny's bare white plump rump, which he didn't really need to see. It made him wince and turn away. But it didn't shut him up. Okay, people, get up, get up, get up, it's time. Today's the day. People, people, people.
He sang a verse of James's stupid middle school song.
In olden times there was a boy, young and strong and bravo.
He was a cheerleader now, waving his pom-poms, jumping up and down, doing splits on the parquet, shouting as loud as he could.
We are going to fill. Oh, re.
B-O-O. K. B-O-O. K. The time neutral R-Y. They held hands in a circle in the living room, packs on their backs. It felt like a dorm stunt, like they were all about to drop acid or sing in a cappella show tune or set some kind of wacky campus record. Anais's face blazed with excitement. She hopped up and down despite the load on her back. None of last night's drama had registered on her at all. She was the only person in the room who looked happy to be there. The funny thing was that it had worked. Quentin wouldn't let it alone. He kept hounding them, and eventually, with surprisingly little resistance, they gave in. Today would be the day. Partly they were afraid of him, with his scary glittering paint eyes, but partly it was because they had to admit he was right. It was time to go, and they'd just been waiting for somebody, even somebody as obviously drunk and demented as Quentin was, to stand up and call it.
Looking back, in a philosophical frame of mind, it occurred to Quentin that he'd always thought this would be a happy day, the happiest day of his life. Funny how life had its little ways of surprising you. Little quirks of fate. If he wasn't happy, he did feel unexpectedly liberated. At least he wasn't hunched over with shame anymore. This was pure emotion, unalloyed with any misgivings or caveats or qualifications. Alice was no longer the alabaster saint here. It was not so hard to meet her eyes across the circle, and was that a flicker of embarrassment he saw in hers? Maybe she was learning a little something about remorse, what that felt like. They were down in the muck together now.
They had spent the morning gathering up and packing the gear and the supplies that were already basically gathered up and packed anyway, and rounding up whoever was in the bathroom or dithering over which shoes or had just wandered off out onto the lawn for no obvious reason. Finally, they were all together in the living room in a circle, shifting their weight from foot to foot and looking at each other and saying,
Okay.
Okay?
Everybody okay? Bad mind? Everybody okay?
Let's do it.
Let's do this.
Okay.
Okay!
let's... And then Penny must have touched the button, because they were all rising up together through clear, cold water.
Quentin was first out of the pool, his pack weighing him down. He was sober now, he was pretty sure, but still angry, and brimming over with self-pity. Let it flow. He didn't want to touch anybody, or have anybody touch him. He liked being in the Netherlands, though. The Netherlands had a calming effect, quiet and still. If he could just lie down for a minute, just right here on the old worn stones, just for a minute, maybe he could sleep.
The expensive Persian rug they'd been standing on floated up after them in the water. Somehow it had come through by accident. Had the button mistaken it for their clothing? Funny how these things worked. Quentin waited while the others straggled out of the fountain one by one. They bunched up at the edge, treading water and hanging on to each other, then heaving their backpacks out and crawling up after them over the stone rim. Janet looked pale. She was stuck in the water, with Josh and Elliot on either side helping her stay afloat. She couldn't get over the lip of the fountain. Her eyes were unfocused, and her face was chalk.
I don't know. I don't know what's wrong.
Worried together, they dragged her up out of the water, but there was no strength in her limbs. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to all fours, and the weight of her pack tugged her over onto her side on the paving stones. She lay there wet and blinking. It's not like Quentin had never seen Janet incapacitated before, but this was different.
I don't know if I want to throw up or if I don't.
Something's wrong. The city. She's having an allergic reaction, something like that.
Her voice was not overburdened with sympathy.
Is anybody else getting it? Nobody else. Okay, let's go to phase 2. Let's hurry.
I'm okay. Just let me rest. Jesus, don't you feel it? Doesn't anybody else feel it?
Anais kneeled down next to her in sisterly solidarity. Alice regarded her inscrutably. Nobody else was affected.
This is interesting. Now, why doesn't anybody else?
Hey, asshole. Can't you see she's in pain? Phase 2, asshole, let's go. Furious, he hoped Penny would come after him. Maybe they could have a rematch of their little fight club. But Penny just gave Quentin a calm, assessing look and turned away. He was taking full advantage of the opportunity to rise above, to be the bigger man, the gracious winner.
He rattled a spray can of industrial orange paint and circled the fountain with it, marking the ground with crosses, then set off in the direction he called Palaceward, after the lavish white palazzo on that side of the square. It was no mystery where they were going. The scene in the book was written in Plover's characteristically clear, unambiguous prose. It had the Chatwins walking 3 more squares palaceward and then 1 to the left to get to the fountain that led to Fillory. The rest of the group straggled after him, squelching in their wet clothes. Janet had her arms around Quentin's and Elliot's shoulders. The last jog took them across a stone bridge over a narrow canal. The layout of the city reminded Quentin of a welter's board, but writ large. Maybe the game reflected some distant, barely legible rumor of the Netherlands that had filtered down to Earth. They halted in a tidy square that was smaller than the one they'd started in, and dominated by a large, dignified stone hall that might have been the mayoral seat of a medieval French village. The clock set at the peak of its facade was frozen at noon or midnight. The rain was getting heavier. In the center of the square was a round fountain, a figure of Atlas half crushed beneath a bronze globe.
Okay, this is the one they use in the books, so I'm going through to check weather conditions.
Thoughtful, the big ringmaster. He was nervous, Quentin could see. Not so tough now, Loverman.
What do you want? A drum roll. Go!
Penny took the white button out of his pocket and gripped it in his fist. Taking a deep breath, he mounted the lip of the pool and stepped off, straight-legged, into the still water. At the last moment, he reflexively held his nose with one hand. He dropped into the dark water and disappeared. It had swallowed him up. There was a long hush. The only sound was Janet's hoarse panting and the splashing of the fountain. A minute passed. Then Penny's head broke the surface, sputtering and blowing.
It worked! It's warm! It's summer! It's summer there! There!
Was it Fillory?
I don't know. It's a forest. Rural. No signs of habitation.
Good enough. Let's go.
I'm okay.
No, you're not. Let's go, everybody.
Richard was already going through the packs, tossing out the winter gear, the brand new parkas and woolly hats and electric socks in an expensive multicolored heap.
Line up sitting along the edge. Feet in the water, holding hands.
Quentin wanted to say something sarcastic but couldn't think of anything. There were heavy rusted iron rings set into the edge of the pool. They had stained the stone around them a dark ferrous brown. He lowered his feet into the inky water. The water felt slightly thinner than real water, more the consistency of rubbing alcohol. He stared down at his submerged shoes. He could barely make them out.
Some tiny, sane part of him knew he was out of control, but that wasn't the part of him that had its hands on the wheel. Everything anybody said sounded to him like a nasty double entendre calculated to remind him of Alice and Penny. Atlas appeared to be leering at him. He was dizzy from lack of sleep. He closed his eyes. His head felt huge and diffuse and empty, like a puff of cloud hanging above his shoulders. The cloud began to drift away. He wondered if he was going pass out. He would dearly love to pass out. There was a dead spot in his brain, and he wanted the dead spot to spread and metastasize over the whole of it and blot out all the painful thoughts.
Body armor? Jesus, Anais. Have you even read the books? We're not walking into a firefight. We're probably going to be eating scones with a talking bunny.
Okay, everybody?
They were all sitting, all 8 of them, in an arc around the edge of the fountain, scooched forward so they could drop in without using their hands, which were tightly clasped. Janet lolled on Elliot's shoulder, her white neck exposed. She was out cold. She looked terribly vulnerable. To Quentin's right, Josh was studying him with concern. His huge hand squeezed Quentin's.
It's okay, man. Come on. You're okay. You got this.
Probably everybody took a last look around, locked eyes, felt a frisson. Eliot quoted Tennyson's Ulysses about seeking new worlds and sailing beyond the sunset. Somebody whooped, maybe Anais. The whoop had a francophone quality. But Quentin didn't whoop, and he didn't look. He just stared at his lap and waited for each successive second to impose itself on him in turn like an uninvited guest the way the previous one had. On Penny's signal, they dropped into the fountain together, not quite in sync, but almost. It had a Busby Berkeley feel to it. Janet more or less face planted forward into the water. It was a falling down, a plunge. Outbound from the Netherlands meant descending. It was like they were parachuting, only it was too rapid for that. Somewhere between parachuting and straight free falling, but with no rushing wind. For a long, silent moment, they could see everything. A sea of flourishing leafy canopies extending all the way to the horizon, pre-industrially verdant, giving way to square meadows in one direction that Quentin tentatively tagged as north, as reckoned by a pallid sun and a white sky. He tried to keep an eye on it as they went in. The ground rushed up to slam them. Then, just like that, they were down. Quentin flexed his knees instinctively, but there was no impact or sense of momentum absorbed. All at once they were just standing there. But where was there? It wasn't a clearing exactly. It was more like a shallow ditch, a trench running through a forest, the bottom clogged with dead leaves and loam and twiggy arboreal detritus. Quentin steadied himself with one hand on the sloping bank. Light trickled down thinly through the massed branches overhead. A bird chattered and then left off. The silence was deep and thick. They had been scattered by the transition like a freshly deployed stick of paratroopers, but they were still in sight of one another. Richard and Penny were fighting their way out of a huge dead bush. Alice and Anades were seated on the trunk of a colossal tree that had fallen athwart the ditch, as if they'd been carefully placed there by a giant child arranging dolls. Janet was sitting on the ground with her hands on her thighs, taking deep breaths, the color flooding back into her face. The whole scene had a deeply uncurated feel to it. This was not a forest that had been culled or thinned. This was primeval. This was the way trees lived when they were left to their own devices.
Penny? It's cold, Penny. Why the fuck is it cold?
It was true. The air was dry and bitter. Their clothes were freezing fast. Their breath puffed out white in the frigid stillness. Fine light snow sifted down from the white sky. The ground was hard under the fallen leaves. It was deep winter.
I don't know. It was summer before. Just a second ago. It was hot.
Worry. Will someone please help me down, please?
Josh gallantly took her by her narrow waist and lifted her down. She gave a pleased little squeak.
I just thoughtful. It's the time thing. I just thought of it. It could be 6 months since Penny was here, in Fillory time. Or more like 60 years the way the seasons work. This always happens in the books. There's no way to predict it.
Well, I predict that I'm going to freeze my tits off in 5 minutes. Somebody go back for the jackets.
They all agreed that Penny should go back and get the parkas, and he was an instant away from touching the button when Elliot suddenly lunged at him and grabbed his arm. He pointed out as calmly as possible that if the time streams of Fillory and the Netherlands moved at different speeds, then if Penny went back by himself, it could easily be days or years before he got back to Fillory with the gear, at least from the Fillorian point of view, by which time they could have frozen to death or died of old age or accumulated countless other equally serious problems. If they were going to go, they would all have to go together.
Forget it. I can't go back there. Not yet. I'd rather freeze my tits off than puke my guts out.
Nobody argued. Nobody wanted to leave quite yet anyway, not now that they were finally here in Fillory, or wherever they were. They weren't going anywhere without at least poking around. Penny began making the rounds with his clothes-drying spell.
I think I can see a way to go. On the other side. It sort of turns into a path through the forest. And there's something else too. You're going to want to see this for yourselves.
If they took off their packs, there was enough space at the bottom of the ditch to scramble under the huge trunk on all fours, single-filed, their hands and knees sinking into the thick layer of frostbitten leaves. Elliot came through last, passing the packs ahead of him. They stood up on the other side, slapping dirt off their hands. Penny rushed to hand Alice down from where she sat, but she ignored him and jumped down herself, although it meant crashing down on her hands and knees and picking herself up again. She didn't seem to be particularly relishing her adventure of the night before, Quentin thought. To one side of the path was a small spreading oak. Its bark was dark gray, almost black, and its branches were gnarled and wiggly and all but empty of leaves. Embedded in its trunk at head height, as if the tree had simply grown up around it, was a round ticking clock face, a foot across. One by one, without speaking, they all scrambled up the sloping bank to get a closer look. It was one of the Watcherwoman's clock trees.
Quentin touched the place where the tree's hard, rough bark met the smooth silver bezel around the clock face. It was solid and cold and real. He closed his eyes and followed the curve of it with his finger. He was really here. He was in Fillory. There was no question about it now. And now that he was here, it would finally be all right. He didn't see how yet, but it would. It had to be. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, but hot tears poured helplessly down his cheeks, leaving cold tracks behind them. Against all his own wishes and instincts, he got down on his knees and put his head in his hands and pushed his face into the cold leaves. A sob clawed its way out of him. For a minute, he lost himself. Somebody, he would never know who, not Alice, put their hand on his shoulder. This was the place. He would be picked up, cleaned off, and made to feel safe and happy and whole again here. How had everything gone so wrong? How could he and Alice have been so stupid? It barely even mattered now. This was his life now, the life he had always been waiting for. It was finally here, and it flashed into his head with sudden urgency. Richard was right. They had to find Martin Chatwin if he was somehow still alive. That was the key. Now that he was here, he wasn't going to give it up again. He must know the secret of how to stay here forever. Make it last. Make it permanent.
Quentin got to his feet, embarrassed, and blotted his tears on his sleeve.
Welp, I guess that pretty much tears it. We're in Fillory.
Thoughtful, these clock trees are supposed to be the Watcher Woman's thing. She must still be around.
I thought she was dead.
Maybe we're in an earlier time period. Maybe we went back in time. Like in The Girl Who Told Time.
She and Janet and Quentin didn't look at each other when they spoke.
Thoughtful, maybe. I think they left some of these still growing, though, even after they got rid of her. Remember, they even see one in the Wandering Dune.
I could never finish that book.
Thoughtful, I wonder. Think we could get this thing back to Brakebills? That would make a hell of a present for Fog.
Nobody else seemed inclined to pursue that line of speculation. Josh made double pointy fingers at Elliot and mouthed the word douche.
I wonder if that's the correct time.
Quentin could have stood there and stared at the clock tree all day, but the chill wouldn't let them stand still. The girls were already wandering away. He followed them reluctantly, and soon they were all trooping off together in a ragged group along the ditchcombe path, deeper into Fillory. The sound of their feet shuffling through the dry leaves was deafening in the quiet. No one spoke. For all their careful, practical preparations, there had been very little discussion of strategy or objectives, and now they were here. It was obvious anyway. Why bother planning an adventure? This was Fillory adventure would find them. With every step they took, they half expected a marvelous apparition or revelation to come trotting out of the woods. But nothing much presented itself. It was almost anticlimactic, or was this just the build-up to something really amazing? The remains of ragged stone walls trailed off into the underbrush. The trees around them remained still and stubbornly inanimate, even after Penny, in the spirit of exploration and discovery, formally introduced himself to several of them. Here and there birds chirped and flitted and perched, high up in the trees, but none of them offered them any advice. Every little detail looked superb bright and saturated with meaning, as if the world around them were literally composed of words and letters inscribed in some magical geographical script. Richard took out a compass but found the needle stuck, pinned down against its cardboard backing, as if Fillory's magnetic pole were deep underground, straight down beneath their feet. He flung it away into a bush. Janet hopped up and down as she walked, her hands crammed under her armpits against the cold. Josh speculated about the hypothetical contents of an imaginary porn magazine for intelligent trees that would be entitled N House. They walked for 20 minutes, half an hour at most. Quentin ultimately blew into his hands and withdrew them into the sleeves of his sweater. He was wide awake now and sober, at least for the moment.
We need to get some fawns up in this piece, or some sword fights or whatever.
The path meandered and then faded out. They were expending more and more effort just to push their way through the foliage. There was some internal disagreement as to whether or not there had ever been an actual path, or whether it was just a strip of thin forest, or even whether this was Penny's take. The trees had begun subtly, imperceptibly shifting themselves to get in their way. But before they could arrive at a consensus, they came across a stream percolating through the woods. It was a lovely little winter stream, wide and shallow and perfectly clear, twinkling and lapping along as if it were delighted to have just found this twisty channel. Wordlessly, they gathered at its edge. The rocks were capped with round dollops of snow, and the quieter eddies along the banks had iced over. A branch poking up in the middle of the stream was hung with fabulous Gothic-sculpted icy drops and buttresses all along its length. There was nothing overtly supernatural about it, but it temporarily satisfied their appetite for wonder. On Earth, it would have been a charming little rill, nothing more, but the fact that they were seeing it in Fillory, in another world, possibly the first Earth beings ever to do so, made it a glittering miracle. They had stared at it for a full minute in rapt silence before Quentin realized that right in front of them, emerging from the deepest part of the stream, was a woman's naked head and shoulders.
Oh my god. Shit, you guys.
It was surreal. She was almost certainly dead. The woman's hair was dark and wet and thick with clumped ice. Her eyes, she appeared to be looking right at them, were midnight blue and didn't move or blink, and her skin was a pale pearlescent gray. Her shoulders were bare. She looked 16 at most. Her eyelashes were clotted with frost.
Is she?
Hey, are you all right?
We should help her. Get her out of there.
Quentin tried to get closer, but he slipped on a frozen rock and went in up to his knee. He scrambled back onto the bank, his foot burning with cold. The woman didn't move.
We need rope. Get the rope. There's rope in one of the packs.
The water didn't even look deep enough to submerge her that far. And Quentin actually wondered, horribly, if they were looking at a body that had been severed at the waist and then dumped in the water. Rope! What was he thinking? He was a damn magician. He dropped the pack he was rifling through and began a simple kinetic spell to lift her out. He felt the premonitory warmth of a developing spell in his fingertips, felt the weight and tug of the body in his mind. It felt good to do magic again, to know that he could still focus despite everything. Soon as he started, he realized that the circumstances were scrambled here. Different stars, different seas, different everything. Thank God it was a simple spell. The grammar was a shambles. Olace corrected him in a clipped voice as he worked. Gradually, the woman rose up, dripping out of the water. She was whole, thank God, and naked her body was slim, her breasts slight and girlish. Her nails and nipples were pale purple. She looked frozen, but she shuddered as the magic took hold. Her eyes focused and came awake. She frowned and raised one hand, somehow halting the spell before he was finished, with her toes still trailing in the freezing water.
I am a naiad. I cannot leave the stream. Your magic is clumsy.
It was electrifying. Quentin saw now that she wasn't human. Her fingers and toes were webbed. To his left, he heard a shuffling noise. It was Penny. He was getting down on his knees on the snowy bank.
We humbly apologize. We most humbly seek your pardon.
Jesus Christ. Dork.
The hovering nymph shifted her attention. Stream water reeled down her bare skin. She tilted her head girlishly.
You admire my beauty, human. I am cold. Would you warm me with your burning skin?
Please, if you have a quest to bestow upon us, we would gladly undertake it. We would gladly...
Mercifully, Janet cut him off.
We're visitors from Earth. Is there a city around here that you could direct us to? Maybe Castle Whitespire?
Dash, we would gladly undertake to do your bidding.
Do you serve the rams?
I serve no false gods, human girl, or goddesses. I serve the river, and the river serves me.
Are her other women here? Like us?
Like you? Oh.
At that moment, Quentin felt his telekinetic spell cease to exist. She'd abolished it, though he didn't catch how, without a word or a gesture. In the same instant, the naiad flipped head down and dived, her pale periwinkle buttocks flashing in the air, and vanished into dark water that looked too shallow to contain her. Her head poked up again a moment later.
I fear for you here, human children. This is...
We're not children.
What war?
She smiled again. Between her lavender lips, her teeth were pointy and interlocking like a fighting fish's. She held something dripping in her webbed fist.
a gift from the river. Use it when all hope is lost.
She tossed it at them overhand. Quentin caught it one-handed. He was relieved out of all proportion to its actual importance that he didn't bobble it. Thank God for his old juggling reflexes. When he looked up again, the nymph was gone. They were alone with the chattering brook. Quentin was holding a small ivory horn chased with silver.
Okay, we are definitely not in Kansas anymore.
The others gathered around to look at the horn. Quentin handed it to Elliot, who turned it over a few times, peered into one end, then the other.
I don't feel anything on it at all. Looks like something you'd buy in an airport gift shop.
You wouldn't necessarily feel it.
He took it and stowed the horn in his pack.
We should have asked her if this is Fillory.
Of course it's Fillory.
And I'd like to be sure. And I'd like to know why we're cursed.
Worried? And what's this war? This raises a lot of questions.
And I didn't like those teeth.
Jesus. Jesus. That was a naiad, people. We just saw a river nymph. How cool is that? How cool are we? Huh? Fucking Fillory people.
He grabbed Quentin's shoulders and shook him. He ran at Richard and made him bump chests.
Can I just say that she was pretty hot?
I'll take that over a fawn any day.
Anais swatted him.
Hey, that's Penny's girlfriend you're talking about. Show some respect.
The tension faded, and for a minute they all chattered among themselves, giving one another shit, and just geeking out on the sheer alien magic of it all. Was she corporeal? Did she become fluid when she entered the stream? How else could she submerge herself in such shallow water? And how had she canceled Quentin's spell? What was her function in the magical ecosystem? And what about the horn? Alice was already paging through her worn filigree paperbacks for references to it. Didn't Martin find a magic horn in the first book? After a while, it began to sink in that they'd been outside for 45 minutes in deep winter wearing nothing but jeans and sweaters. Even Janet admitted it was time to head back to the city. Elliot corralled the stragglers and chatterers, and they all leaned hands on the bank of the stream. They stood in a circle, still a little giddy, and for a moment, happy conspiratorial glances flew between them. There was some bad personal stuff going down, but that didn't have to ruin everything, did it? They were doing something really important here. This was what every one of them had been waiting for, looking for their whole lives, what they were meant to do. They'd found the magic door, the secret path through the hidden garden. They'd gotten a hold of something new, a real adventure, and it was only just beginning. It was in that hush that they heard it for the first time, a dry, rhythmic ticking sound. It was almost lost in the twittering of the brook, but it grew louder and more distinct. One by one, they stopped talking to listen. It was snowing more heavily now. Out of context, it was hard to place. Alice was the first to twig.
It's a clock. That's a clock ticking.
She searched their faces impatiently.
A clock. Watcher-woman. That's the Watcher-woman.
Penny fumbled hastily for the button. The tick-tock grew even louder, like a monstrous heart beating, right on top of them. But it was impossible to tell what direction it was coming from. And then it didn't matter, because they were floating up through cold, clear water to safety. This time it was all business. Back in the city, they gathered up the cold weather gear all except for Janet, who lay limply on the ground doing yoga breathing, and then got back in the fountain where they linked hands along the edge with what was becoming practiced ease. Janet found the strength to make a joke about Anita Ekberg in La Dolce Vita. They nodded once all around and slipped back in unison. They were in Fillory again, sat down by the stream they'd just left, but the snow was gone. It was an early fall day now, the air full of lukewarm mist. The temperature felt like high 60s. It was like time-lapse photography. The branches of trees that had been bare 5 minutes ago now swarmed with turning leaves. One golden leaf floated tinnily, impossibly high in the gray sky on some fluky updraft. The grass was littered with glassy puddles from a torrential autumn rain that must have ended only minutes earlier. They stood around in the mild air, hugging their bundles of parkas and woolly gloves, and feeling foolish.
Overdressed again. Story of my life.
No one could think of a reasonable alternative to just leaving the winter gear lying there on the wet grass. They could have gone back to the Netherlands to store it, but then it might have been winter all over again when they got back. It seemed ridiculous, a bug in the system, but it didn't matter. They were energized now. They filled their canteens from the stream. A bridge spanned the creek 50 yards downstream, a gentle arch made of intricate, curly Filiorian ironwork.
Pralprek Quentin was sure it couldn't have been there before, but Richard insisted they just hadn't seen it through the snow-laden branches. Quentin looked at the flowing, burbling water. There was no sign of the nymph. How much time had passed since they were last here? He wondered. Seasons in Fillory could last a century, or had they gone back in time? Was this the same adventure, or were they starting a new one?
On the far side of the bridge, there was a wide, neat path through the forest, dusted with leaves and pine needles, but definitely a path in good standing this time, an official path. They made good time, their spirits buoyed up by the perfect weather, and a constant low-level adrenaline drip. It was really on now, no more false starts. It wasn't that Fillory could wipe out what happened last night, but maybe it could, for all he knew. Anything could happen here. A brown deer ambled out of the forest and walked ahead of them for a stretch, looking back over its shoulder with an air of genuinely exceptional intelligence. They all agreed. But if it could speak, it declined to address them. They tried to follow it. Maybe it was leading them somewhere. Was it a messenger from Ember and Umber? But it bounded away exactly the way an ordinary non-magical deer would have. Josh practiced a spell that uncurled Anas's hair from a distance. She kept looking around, annoyed but unable to pinpoint the source. Janet linked arms with Quentin and Elliot and made them do a follow-the-yellow-brick road skipping dance. He couldn't be sure, but he didn't think Elliot had a drink all day. When was the last time that had happened When was the last time that had happened? The forest seemed to go on forever. Once in a while, the sun appeared long enough to shoot some long, dusty beams down between the trees, then disappeared again.
This is right. This is right to me. We're supposed to be here.
Janet rolled her eyes.
What do you think, Q? Doesn't this feel right to you?
Without knowing how it happened, Quentin had Penny's ratty t-shirt bunched in his fists. Penny weighed more than he'd counted on, but Quentin still managed to get him off balance and push him backward until his head clunked against the damp trunk of a pine tree.
Never speak to me. Do you understand? You do not address me directly, ever. You do not speak to me.
Worried? I don't want to fight you. That's exactly what the Watcher woman wants.
Furious. Did you not just hear what I said, you lardy little fucking nub? Did you not just fucking hear what I fucking said? Was I unclear in any way?
He walked away without waiting for an answer. Fillory had better give him something to fight soon or he was going to lose it completely. The novelty of actually physically being in Fillory was wearing thin. In spite of everything, a mood of general grumpiness was growing, a spoiled picnic mood. Every time a bird perched overhead for more than a few seconds, Josh would say, "Okay, this is the one," or "I think it's trying to tell us something," or eventually, "Hey asshole, fly away from me please." "Okay, thanks."
Worried at least the Watcher woman hasn't shown up.
If that even was the Watcher woman before. Supposedly, they got her in the first book, right? So,
Yeah, I know, but something's a little off here. I don't understand why that nymph wasn't boring us about Ember and Umber. They're always so pushy about them in the books.
If there's a war between the Rams and the Watcher Woman still going on, we're going to want to get with Ember and Umber stat.
Oh, yeah, stat.
If they want us on their side, they will find us. We need have no fear on that score.
No one answered him. It was becoming increasingly clear that Penny's encounter with the nymph had put him in an altered state. That was how he was dealing with Fillory. He'd undergone a conversion experience, flipped into full-on Renaissance fair role-playing mode.
Watch it! Watch it!
They registered the drumming thuds of hooves on soft earth almost too late. A carriage drawn by 2 horses tore past them at a full gallop, scattering them into the trees on either side of the road. The carriage was closed and dark. On its side, it bore what looked like a coat of arms that had recently been painted over in black. The coachman was bundled up in a black cloak. It was impossible to tell signaled the horses to slow to walk, then to stop 100 feet ahead of them down the road.
The thick plottins.
It was about damn time something happened. Quentin, Janet, and Anais walked boldly toward it, all competing to be the reckless one, the hero, the one who pushed things forward. In his present state of mind, Quentin felt fully prepared to go right up and knock on the shutters, but he found himself pulling up a few yards away. So did the others. The black coach did look ominously funereal.
Do they bear the horns?
This was evidently directed not at them, but at the coachman, who had the better vantage point. If the coachman replied, he/she did so inaudibly.
Do you bear the horns?
The advance party exchanged looks.
What do you mean, horns? We're not from around here.
This was ridiculous. It was like talking to the Onceler and Dr. Seuss.
Do you serve the bull? Who's the bull? We are visitors to your land. We do not serve the bull, or anybody else for that matter.
They're not deaf, Quentin.
Long silence. One of the horses, they were black too, as was the tackle, and everything else wickered. The first voice said something inaudible.
What?
A trapdoor banged open on top of the carriage. The sound was like a gunshot. A tiny expressionless head and a long green insect torso popped up out of it. It could only have been a praying mantis, but grown grotesquely to human size. It was so skinny, and it had so many long emerald-colored legs and graceful whip antennae that at first Quentin didn't notice that it was holding a green bow with a green arrow nocked.
Shit.
His voice cracked. It was close range and there was no time to run. He cringed violently and fell down. The horses took off like a shot the moment the mantis released. The trapdoor banged shut again. Dust and twigs spun up into the air in the carriage's wake, its 4 big wheels fitting neatly in the ruts in the road. When Quentin dared to look up again, Penny was standing over him. He held the arrow in one hand. He must have used a spell to speed up his reflexes. Fillorian circumstances be damned, then plucked it out of the air in mid-flight. It would have neatly speared Quentin's kidney. The others came straggling up to watch the carriage recede into the distance.
wait.
Jesus, Penny, nice catch.
What? Was she going to fuck him now? He stared at the arrow in Penny's hand, panting. It was a yard long and fletched in black and yellow like a hornet. The tip had 2 angry curly steel barbs welded to it. He hadn't even had time to panic.
He took a shaky breath.
That all you got?
Slowly, he got to his feet. His knees were water and wouldn't stop shaking. Penny turned and, in an odd gesture, offered him the arrow. Quentin snorted angrily and walked away, slapping leaf junk off his hands. He didn't want Penny to see him trembling. It probably would have missed anyway.
Wow. That was one angry bug.
The day wore on. Light was leaking out of the sky and the fun was leaking out of the afternoon. Nobody wanted to admit they were frightened, so they took the only other option, which was to be irritable instead. If they didn't go back soon, they'd have to find somewhere to make camp for the night in the woods, which maybe wasn't such a good idea if they were going to get shot at by giant bugs. None of them had enough medical magic to handle a barbed shaft to the small intestine. They stood and argued on the dirt road. Should they go back to Buffalo? Maybe pick up some Kevlar after all? There were only so many arrows Penny could catch. Would Kevlar even stop an arrow? And what kind of political situation were they walking into here? Bugs and bulls, nymphs and witches? Who were the good guys and who were the bad guys? Everything was much less entertaining and more difficult to organize than they'd counted on. Quentin's nerves were thoroughly jangled and he kept touching the place on his stomach under his sweater, where the arrow would have gone in. What was it, mammals versus insects now? But then why would a praying mantis be fighting for a bull? The nymph had said this wasn't their war. Maybe she had a point.
Quentin's feet were killing him, breaking in his brand new hiking boots. He'd never dried off the foot he'd soaked in the stream before, and now it felt hot and blistered and mildewy. He imagined painful fungal spores taking root and flourishing in the warm wetness between his toes. He wondered how far they'd walked. It had been about 30 hours since he'd slept.
Both Penny and Anais were adamantly against turning back. What if the Chatwins had turned back? Penny said. They were part of a story now. Had anybody actually ever read a story? This was the hump, the hard part, the part they'd be rewarded for later. You just had to get through it. And not to go on, but who are the good guys here? We the good guys, and the good guys always survive.
Wake up. This isn't a story. It's just one fucking thing after another. Somebody could have died back there.
She obviously meant Quentin, but didn't want to say his name.
Maybe Helen Chatwin was right. Maybe we're not supposed to be here.
You don't get it, do you? It's supposed to be confusing at the beginning. The situation will get explained in time. We just have to keep moving, keep picking up clues. If we leave now and come back, it'll be like 500 years from now and we'll have to start all over again.
Quentin looked from one to the other of them. Alice smart and skeptical. Janet all action and thoughtless exuberance. He turned to Anais to ask her how far she thought they'd walked, on the vague theory that a European person might have a more accurate sense of these things than a bunch of Americans, when he realized he was the only one of the party who wasn't staring off into the forest to their right, passing them through the darkening trees. On a parallel course was the strangest thing Quentin had ever seen. It was a birch tree, striding along through the forest. Its trunk forked a meter from the ground to form two legs on which it took stiff, deliberate steps. It was so thin that it was hard to keep track of in the half-light, but its white bark stood out from the dark trunks around it. Its thin upper branches whipped and snapped against the trees it pushed past. Thoughtful, what jittia? The Magicians, cast by Artel Studio. Please subscribe to our channel if you enjoy listening. Was Sheener a marionette than a person? Quentin wondered how it kept its balance.
Holy crap.
Without speaking, they began to trail after it. The tree didn't hail them, but for a moment its crown of branches twisted in their direction as if it were glancing over a shoulder it didn't have. In the stillness, they could actually hear it creaking as it forged along, like a rocking chair. Quentin got the distinct impression it was ignoring them.
Thoughtful. After the first 5 minutes of magical wonderment, past it began to be socially awkward, blatantly following the tree spirit thing like this. But it didn't seem to want to acknowledge them, and they weren't about to let it go. As a group, they clung to it. Maybe this thing was going to put them in the picture, if it didn't turn around and beat them all to death with its branches.
Janet kept a close eye on Penny and shushed him whenever he looked like he might be about to say something.
Let it make the first move.
Freak show. What is that thing?
It's a dryad, idiot.
I thought those were girl trees. Supposed to be sexy girl trees.
And I thought dryads were oaks. That's a birch.
Thoughtful, what makes you think it's not a girl tree?
Whatever it is, it's pay dirt. Fucking tree thing, man. Pay fucking dirt.
The tree was a fast walker, almost bouncing along on its springy, kneeless legs to the point where soon they would have to break into a half jog to keep up with it. Just when it looked like they were either going to lose their only promising lead so far or segue into an undignified chase scene, it became obvious where it was heading anyway. Humbledrum.
Relieved. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a booth in a dimly lit bar with a pint of beer on the table in front of me, as yet untasted. Though unexpected, this felt like a good development for me. Bar, booth, beer. This was a situation where I knew how to handle myself, whatever world I was in. If I'd been training for anything since I left Brakebills, it was this.
Identical pints stood in front of the others. It was late afternoon, 5:30 or so, Quentin guessed, though how could you know? Were there even 24 hours in a day here? Why would there be? Despite Penny's insistence that the tree had been leading them here, it was pretty clear they would have found the inn on their own. It was a dark, low-roofed log cabin with a sign outside featuring 2 crescent moons. A delicate little clockwork mechanism caused the 2 moons to revolve around each other when the wind blew. The cabin was backed up against and appeared almost to emerge from a low hillock that humped up out of the forest floor. Cautiously pushing inside through swinging doors, they discovered what could have passed for a period room in a museum of colonial America. A long, narrow chamber with a bar against one wall. It reminded Quentin of the historic old innies he'd wandered through when he was visiting his parents in Chesterton. Only one other booth was occupied by a family 5 less a tall, white-haired old man, a high-cheekboned woman who might have been in her 30s, and a serious little girl. Obviously locals. They sat perfectly silent and erect, staring balefully at the empty cups and saucers in front of them. The little girl's hooded eyes expressed a precocious acquaintance with adversity. The walking birch tree had disappeared, presumably into a back room. The bartender wore a curious old-fashioned uniform, black with many brass buttons, something like what an Edwardian policeman might have worn. He had a narrow, bored face and heavy black 5 o'clock shadow, and he slowly polished pint glasses with a white cloth in the manner of bartenders since time immemorial. Otherwise, the room was empty, except for a large brown bear wearing a waistcoat sitting slumped in a sturdy armchair in one corner. It wasn't clear whether the bear was conscious or not. Richard had brought along several dozen small gold cylinders in the hope that they would work as a kind of universal interdimensional currency. The bartender accepted one without comment, weighed it expertly in his palm, and returned a handful of change. 4 dented, wobbly coins stamped with an assortment of faces and animals. 2 of them bore mottos in 2 different unreadable scripts. The third was a well-worn Mexican peso from the year 1936. The 4th turned out to be a plastic marker from a board game called Sorry. He set about filling pewter tankards. Josh stared into his dubiously and took a fastidious sniff. He was as fidgety as a 3rd grader.